Hello everyone, and well, it's the end of the month, so it's that time again. It is the Patreon Drydock. So, let's get strapped in and see how many questions we're answering this week. Bob Hedges asks, you've spoken at length about the history of naval propulsion systems, but unless I missed it, relatively little about the evolution of the fuel itself. Did the chemistry, purity, or refining methods change significantly during the period covered by the channel? Did newer power plants require more purity or more specific chemistry of the oil they burned, i.e. was later equipment more optimised for specific fuel types, and if so, were there restrictions on being unable to take fuel from certain facilities? Sort of, but also no. So during the main period of self-propelled vessels that the channel covers, we're essentially talking about coal firing and oil firing, and a little bit of a mix in between the two at the junction. Now, when it comes especially to coal-fired boilers, essentially the point is you put the fuel in the furnace burns up the fuel, this generates heat, the heat makes the steam, and off you go. Exactly what it is you're burning in the short term is actually relatively unimportant, except for the fact that some fuels will burn hotter and release more energy per pound or per kilo than others. So it is possible to ruin your boiler by putting in a fuel that actually burns too hot and will start to cause problems for the structural integrity of the metal that the boiler's made of. It's also possible to feed it fuel that just doesn't burn very hot at all and basically will generate little to no steam. But that's why coal was kind of a standard, because it had a broad range of characteristics, but you could make almost any coal work with steam power. And indeed, in a number of cases of coal-powered vessels, certainly towards the earlier part of the coal-firing period, but also to a degree towards the later part, when ships were running low on coal, they could and did throw anything that would burn in there, wooden furniture and fittings being one of the things that quite often ended up in the fires of a ship that was short on its coal. However, within the range of the coal that you would by default hopefully be using, there's a lot of different chemical variations within that coal. And as I've covered, and repeatedly mentioned with regards to World War I and the Grand Fleet versus the High Seas Fleet, the default coal that was available to the High Seas Fleet in wartime, i.e. from Germany, was pretty low-grade stuff. It didn't burn with quite as much energy per pound or per kilo, which limits how much energy you can get out of the boiler, because obviously there's a physical limit to the space within the boiler that you can shovel fuel into. And it generated a lot more byproducts, ash, clinker, tarry deposits, etc., which could and did choke up the funnels, the feeds, and all other parts of the boilers, which then required cleaning out whilst the ship was at sea. Whereas British ships were gifted by the fact that the British Isles, especially Wales, but also parts of the northeast, had, and to a certain degree still have, very large deposits of anthracite coal, which burns a lot more cleanly and with somewhat more energy, which means that A, you're going to get slightly more power out of the same boiler, assuming you're using the same boiler for comparison purposes, but also it's going to be a lot longer before you need to clean out that boiler, so you're going to maintain your performance for longer. And a similar thing is true once you switch over to oil firing. Now, in both oil and coal firing cases, there is absolute premium refined product, but you are generally not going to find that used in ships unless, as with Welsh coal deposits, you have vast amounts of it, because it tends to be normally very, very, very expensive compared to the low-grade stuff that's left over in bulk after refining has been done, or in some cases before any refining has been done. And ships tend to need hundreds of tons of coal or oil to get going per journey, and translate that into litres and gallons, and it becomes astronomical in terms of numbers. And as a result, you can't afford to run a fleet on the most premium fuel that you can theoretically access all the time. Although it is known that some ships were run, for example, on their trial runs to test out their speed using specially picked premium fuel. But as I said, with oil, there was a similar thing going. There was some better grades of bunker fuel, but then you have general bunker fuel, which is not particularly pleasant stuff, and in some cases and environments actually needs warming up to become liquid enough to actually circulate through the system. It can be pretty viscous. And at the extreme low end of things, you have the Japanese at the middle and latter parts of World War II, where they're really getting desperate for fuel, and they're essentially just filling up on what's basically pure crude coming out of the Dutch East Indies before much, if any, refining has been done. And similar to coal, you could run your boilers on this horrible stuff, but they would perform better with better qualities of fuel, kind of like your car. You know, if you go up and you get the regular unleaded petrol or diesel, or you pay a premium for whatever the premium grade is, and then perhaps you add performance additives to that after you've fueled up, you'll get different grades of performance out of your car engine. It's just a matter of how much performance are you going to get out of that engine and how long before you have to stop and go, boilers need cleaning out because things have gone horribly wrong. But as you mentioned, some later engines were optimized for a specific fuel type, and that wasn't to say that they couldn't burn other stuff, as we just discussed, but it was more a case of, we want X ship to go at Y speed, and therefore it needs Z power. To get Z power, you use a certain number of boilers, burning a certain amount of fuel, which will cause the boilers to generate the certain amount of power that you need to get the ship up to the speed that you want. If you feed it a premium fuel, you might get a bit more power, the ship might go a bit faster, and if you feed it junk fuel, then you won't get as much power and the ship will go slower. Martin Smith asks, I've noticed in World of Warships that the Atago has an unusual triple front turret layout. Was this a good idea, and was it effective? So, 3 turrets up front is actually a relatively common layout for Japanese heavy cruisers of the interwar period. The Miyokos, the Megamis, both before and after their conversion into heavy cruisers, and of course the Takaos, of which Atago is one, all have this layout. The Nelsons obviously have also 3 turrets up front, albeit they don't have any at the rear, in a slightly different layout. As you can see in this picture, the Atago, rather specifically, has A turret, then B turret superfiring over A, and then C turret is right up next to B, but facing backwards, whereas on something like, say, a Nelson class and some other ships that have a similar 3 turret all up front layout, C turret or turret 3, if you're American, would be also facing forward. So the gun barrels would be pointing at the back of B barbette, which would then mean that the turret itself would be further back, closer to the superstructure. But this particular clustering of turrets is common to a few ships, including the Brooklyn class of the US Navy. Now, in terms of was it a good idea, well, in the Japanese case, they wanted a lot of 8-inch guns, so all of their heavy cruisers post World War I are 10-gun vessels, starting with the Miyokos. But as you also see with the Fusos, the Issei, and even to a certain extent the Nagatos, the Japanese are constantly focused on the idea that they're going to be fighting outnumbered, and so they want as many turrets as possible to engage as many targets as possible, and also to lose the minimum number of guns if a turret is knocked out. And that leads them pretty much until you get to the Yamatos to sticking with the twin turret, because if you have, in this case, 5 twin turrets, 3 up front, 2 up the back, you have 10 guns, and it's going to take 5 separate turret hits, in theory, to knock them out. Assuming, of course, that if you've clustered them all together and one hit doesn't take out all of them. You could, of course, get 1 less gun, so 9 guns on 3 triple turrets, which would be a much more efficient layout and probably save a bit of weight, but then you face the problem of losing a third of your armament to a single hit instead of a fifth. But, you know, multiple twins versus fewer triples, there's the engineering argument that favours the triples or even quads, and there's the tactical argument that in some cases favours twins, so that's a slightly separate matter. But in terms of it being a good idea generally, for what the Japanese intended to do with their ships, it was a reasonably good one. And, well, in surface combat at least, the class proved pretty effective, especially with their front guns, so that works. About the only minor problem with this kind of turret layout is that the third turret, i.e. C turret, has somewhat limited forward fire arcs compared to if it was flipped around and pointing forward Nelson style. And also it means that if you're in an engagement where the enemy is in your forward quarter and crosses over your bow, or you turn to present the other side of your vessel, that rear turret has to do a very large rotation compared to the front two turrets to keep on target. Albeit that when you're talking about the rotation speed of the turrets versus how often the turrets would actually be firing, you might only miss a salvo or two. HMS Inconceivable asks, when did ships begin to produce enough drinking water for their crew? Were there any key challenges other than power generation that had to be overcome? It's a surprisingly stop-start story. Various early forms of distillation, evaporation, condensation, and various other ways of making fresh water for a ship's crew are actually recorded being installed on ships all the way back to the 16th century, believe it or not. But they're largely kind of flash-in-the-pan, one-off things. As you get to the latter part of the 18th century, they start to become a little bit more common, but one, their total capacity is limited, so it's more of a topping up to existing water supplies rather than we can generate all the water we need from them. And two, of course, they need some form of power in the form of heat, which on a sailing ship that normally doesn't have sources of open flame for heat is something of a problem, which is why, for example, HMS Victory, which does have a small distillation apparatus, has it fitted in the ship's galley, where that's the only place where they're supposed to have fire most of the time. Once you get to the age of steam, of course, you now have plenty of available heat, incidentally, coming off of the boilers, and you also have the need to store large amounts of water on board, not just for the crew. And so once you get into the age of steam, particularly the 1850s, late 1850s through to the early 1870s, that's when a lot of breakthroughs occur in terms of larger scale, more efficient water evaporation or distillation systems, which then can provide enough water on an ongoing basis for the crew, although you would still be storing stuff in tanks because, total output is at a certain rate versus peak demand at certain times. And, of course, the problem of the power, the heat to run the things has been solved by the fact you just use the latent heat of the boilers. The two main challenges other than a source of power was scale, which, scaled in two terms. Scale in terms of the size of the things and actually them working, and scale as in the build-up of scale, i.e. lime scale and other kinds of debris, brine and so forth, that would come from, distilling or evaporating off seawater. And how the material that the machine was made of either resisted that or disposed of it, or how easy it was to access it to clean it. That was a fairly major challenge to overcome, along with stability, because you could make a really good unit on land, and if you took it to sea, quite a lot of the time it would not work, or it would work imperfectly, because obviously ships pitch and roll, and water being a liquid tends to get thrown around inside anything you store it in. So coming up with a system that would resist this and work regardless of what the ship was doing was another fairly big challenge they had to deal with. Brian Stevens asks, what in your mind was the best class of World War II fleet submarine? Well, technically they were all complete failures, because the purpose of a fleet submarine, as the name suggests, is to operate with the fleet. And no class of submarine was ever particularly successful in doing that, if they had any success at all during the Second World War. However, once you go on to just how did they do in World War II, there are two measures by which I think you can measure the success of a fleet submarine, and thus how good it is, what makes the best class. Firstly, you can look at the pure technical specs. So, how far could they go? How deep could they go? How many torpedoes did they carry? How many could they fire in a single salvo? It kind of the submarine version of the speed protection firepower paradigm for surface vessels. However, for the purposes of this question, I don't think that's necessarily an entirely fair comparison, mainly because you can point to some absolutely excellent and superb large fleet submarine designs that either during the war were complete and utter failures in practice because doctrine, usage, enemy escorts, etc. And you can also point to some that are technically World War II, but didn't really do all that much because they were only being commissioned and sent into combat in the late 1944 and early 1945 period, or maybe even just 1945. So technical specs probably a little bit misleading for this particular question, in which case my nomination would go to the Balao class fleet submarine of the US Navy, because it combines a good set of technical specs. It's got a decent amount of firepower, it's got a decent amount of speed, it's got a pretty good endurance, etc. So it's not deficient particularly in any of these respects. And obviously it comes into service a little bit later into the war compared to the Gatos, which means that it's usually firing torpedoes that actually work, which helps. And it has, as a class, a pretty successful war, and unlike the Tench class, their follow-ons, the Balaos are around for a good chunk of the Pacific campaign, which allows them to actually, show their effectiveness. Whereas with the best will in the world, the Tenches, they come in late enough in the war that, to be honest, almost any fleet submarine would have been pretty successful off of the Japanese coast in 1944-45, and to a short period of time they can't really stretch their legs and show their colours quite the same way that the Balaos get to. And the reason I'd select the Balao over the Gato class is because the Balaos have a much better diving depth and thus are also more resistant to damage when they're being depth charged through a very, very simple expedient of, because they are essentially a modified Gato design, someone just going, well, we've got this lead weight at the bottom of the Gato class, which is supposed to balance out the buoyancy of the hull, but we need the lead for the war industries, and it's just a static load that doesn't otherwise do anything other than, keep the ship's buoyancy at a fixed level when the tanks are at certain amounts of air pressure. So how about instead of that, we just delete that feature and just make the pressure hull slightly thicker? Then the sub weighs exactly the same. It has the same level of buoyancy, except it can now also, go deeper because the hull is stronger. Insert clever name here asks, I've noticed a lot of torpedoes have what seem to be bronze or brass caps at the front or warhead section. Why is this? Originally, entire torpedoes might be made of bronze, although later on, as you mentioned, only the cap would be and the rest of the torpedo body would be made of steel. The essential feature in this regard was corrosion resistance. Steel, obviously, even if painted, will rust relatively quickly in a salt air environment like the sea, and bronze doesn't. I mean, it does get a little bit of a patina, but you don't get full-on rust going on. So if you made the entire torpedo body and head out of bronze, then it wouldn't rust at all, which is good. But once you've got to the point where you're storing these things in sealed tubes where perhaps only the head is protruding, then it makes sense for the head to still be bronze, because that's the bit that could get rusty. There's also a safety factor, which is that you have to put the detonator and the warhead in the front. And if you're trying to pack down cakes of gun cotton or later on Torpex or TNT, well, you'd rather not strike sparks in those cases, just in case. At which point bronze, much like the copper that they used to line Age of Sail magazines with, doesn't strike sparks. So that's good. Later on, as you get into the interwar period on World War II, another factor which is equally as important comes about, which is the use of magnetic influence detonators, which broadly speaking, tend to really suck at the beginning of World War II. It's just a question of how quickly everybody fixes their non-working versions. But one of the things that is very apparent very quickly in early testing is that if you stick a magnetic influence detonator in a steel head case, it's not going to work. Because obviously the steel is primarily made of iron, which means it's ferromagnetic, which messes with the detonator, whereas the non-magnetic bronze head allows the magnetic detonator to see outside effectively into the magnetic fields of the surrounding ocean, and thus work correctly. Avalon asks, how important - effective were anti-submarine nets at harbour entrances during World War II? After Atlantic destroyer convoy duty, my dad, an electrician's mate, was transferred to USS Larch AN-21 in Trinidad to repair ships and close the submarine nets at night for the remainder of his service. They're pretty important, although anti-submarine nets in World War II are, unlike the anti-torpedo nets of early World War I, where they're connected on booms and attached to individual ships, they are pretty much entirely deployed, as you can see in this case in Canada, to guard harbour entrances, and as you mentioned, down in Trinidad as well, and in the UK and other places. But anti-submarine nets are very much like an IT team at a large corporate office, in that you need them, you deploy them, and if you deploy them, 99.99% of the time, nothing happens, which can lead people to underappreciate them and then think they can get rid of them, and then everything goes horribly, horribly wrong. And of course, the 0.001% of the time that something does go wrong regardless, when, say, you get a very sneaky submarine commander who perhaps goes into the harbour whilst the net is temporarily open to let another ship through, like the Italian 10th flotilla that did with their not human torpedoes per se, but the Maiale essentially adapted torpedoes with their detonating charges that they used to cripple Queen Elizabeth and Valiant in Alexandria, sneak in while the net's open. But when those things go wrong, it's tempting to just say, oh, well, these things are useless, the anti-sub nets, but in actual fact, the fact that you've had this underwater attack, but it's incredibly rare, points to the fact that most of the time they're pretty effective. So the point of them, as you can see, they're big steel nets, they get strung across the harbour, and the idea is that without them in place, enemy submarines could enter your narrow, confined harbour waters, where there are lots of ships, usually stationary, and get an absolute feast of torpedoing going on. And indeed, the lack of anti-submarine nets and, well, effective ones, effectively deployed nets at Scapa Flow is one of the reasons U-47 was able to sneak in and sink Royal Oak near the beginning of the war. So overall, they are very important in terms of defending harbours and shipping from submarine attack. And of course, when you're opening the nets, when you're opening those nets, you can, in theory, have lots of escorts with ASDIC sonar and depth charges pinging away to make sure that enemy submarines aren't in the immediate vicinity, although, as said, with places like Alexandria, etc., doesn't necessarily always work, but it's a lot safer to have them than not. And in terms of effectiveness, again, as with any relatively static defense, somebody really clever can come up with a way of overcoming them, but the number of instances you get with them is much fewer than the number of instances you'd have without them. Alec Ruby asks, who invented the term turtleback armour? Is it a modern invention, or does it come from much earlier? I've got to admit, this question actually made me laugh quite a lot when I read it originally, because way back, I think it's like 3 or 4 years ago, in the earlier days of the channel, there was a very, very angry person. I mean, you do occasionally get very angry people with not much sense wandering around in the comment sections, but this particular person was very angry, left a bunch of rants and everything before he wandered off into the great wild yonder of the internet. But 2 of the comments that really stuck out to me was, one, he posted a comment, "There is no such thing as the Crown Colony class. You're a bad historian. It's the Fiji class." And the other one was, This just shows further that you're not a proper historian at all. There's no such thing as turtleback armour. It was a term invented by the World of Warships streamer Flamu. No one at the time called it this. And in both cases, I just looked at it and laughed and was like, mate, how to tell me you know nothing about naval history without actually just outright saying it. I mean, in the Crown Colony case, I can point you to any number of early 1940s documents that describe Crown Colony type or Crown Colony class cruisers. Yes, they were also called VG class, but the term is contemporaneous. And in terms of turtleback armour, with the greatest of respect to Flamu, because, you know, he does some fairly interesting World of Warships stuff, he didn't invent turtleback armour, and I don't think he's ever claimed to as a term. I don't know exactly who did, but a fairly simple perusal of older journals will point out the fact that turtleback armour as a term specifically, as you can see here, for the kind of sloped deck protection that was common on protected cruisers and then later on battleships, and armoured cruisers for that matter, that goes way back. Yeah, there's the Journal of the Royal United Service Institution from 1875 uses the term turtleback armour in relation to armour being fitted to various Russian ships at the time. There's the Illustrated Naval and Military magazine of 1886, which talks about German experiments on chilled iron turtleback armour plates. And as you go through into the latter part of the 1880s and the 1890s, the term turtleback armour or turtle deck armour or turtle deck, variations thereof, is incredibly common, not just in professional journals, but also in the general media, because, well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out the relationship between the two. You also get whaleback, but that is more to do with the shape of the upper hull rather than the shape of armour, which is almost universally referred to, when it's not just called protected deck, as some variation on the turtle theme. So yeah, it's an old term that's pretty much contemporaneous with the invention of the scheme in the first place. Silder and Machine Works asks, two related questions about artillery fuses. First, we know that navies use timed and radar fuses to airburst shells fired at aircraft. Was airbursting ever used for shore bombardment in the manner of land-based artillery? Also, armour-piercing shells had internal fuses or base fuses. How did they work? There was some degree of airbursting shells used in shore bombardment, but you've got to remember that the Allies were paranoid for a good chunk of World War II about the VT fuse and the potential of it falling into enemy hands. So whilst a VT fuse, aka a proximity fuse, could be used, in theory, to provide air bursts over enemy troop concentrations during shore bombardments, it pretty much wasn't. If they were going to do air bursts at all, it would be using the mechanically timed fuse, although even then, it's not really going to have a huge call for it, because most, not all, but most naval bombardment was about blowing things into tiny, tiny, tiny pieces. And that usually meant trying to hit them with high explosives or landing very close to them and using normal contact detonators. Now, with the armour-piercing shell fuses, everyone's fuses work slightly differently, but generally work to approximately the same principle. So a very general guidance to armour-piercing shell fuses. The reason that they are internal and most usually at the base is because obviously the front end is hitting something. So given that an AP shell wants a slight time delay before it detonates to allow the shell to pass through the armour and into the vitals of the ship, having it on the nose, which is the bit that's, if anything, going to get squashed very flat and possibly broken up on passing through the armour, is not a good idea, because it'll destroy the fuse before the fuse has a chance to actually fully initiate. So you have it on the back, which is hopefully the bit that's most likely to survive, but it is essentially an impact fuse, but with extra steps. So the shell impacts something, that causes a shock to travel through the shell and a deceleration. That will then cause either a small primer charge to be thrown onto a firing pin, or a firing pin to be thrown onto a small charge, or a spring release to fire a firing pin onto the small primer charge, again depending on the exact makeup and period of the fuse. But essentially a very, very small primer charge is set off, and then this, as it expands, might either set off a further element of the primer charge, or in and of itself might be considered enough. Quite often these charges would be some form of crystalline explosive, and the explosion from this primer and any potential continuation charges would be funneled through one or more small tubes, which will have been drilled into a metal plate as part of the mechanism, and sometimes these tubes will actually contain the crystalline explosive, which will have a known burn rate. But at any stage, there will be a known burn rate of the priming charge, which will then carry through these tubes, which will then reach the main primer, which will initiate the explosive that makes up the AP shell's actual warhead. Cisco Fan asks, I heard it was Churchill as First Sea Lord who eased the Navy's social requirements to be an officer, allowing more common-born people to apply. If it wasn't him, then who was it? When was it done? And was it done all at once or in stages? So I don't think it was Churchill. I was lucky to be present at a lecture by Professor Andrew Lambert, and he was pointing out that actually the requirements for social hierarchy for entry into the Royal Navy were recognised and addressed before Churchill had anything particularly to do with the Navy by Corbett and Admiral Fisher, which is actually one of the reasons why Dartford Naval College was founded. Dartmouth, not Dartford. Dartmouth Naval College was founded at the very beginning of the 20th century. And in fact, Professor Lambert made a point of the fact that Corbett and Fisher made the point to the Navy as part of the justification for Dartmouth that according to the Royal Navy's rules at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, Horatio Nelson himself would not have been able to apply to join the Royal Navy. And since this was patently an absurd situation, they had to, get their act together and relax the requirements a little bit in terms of what your social status in the hierarchy was. But of course, as with most things that involve a degree of social change, the changes weren't immediate. Well, they were immediate in terms of, on paper, it said this could happen, but in terms of actual, effects and allowing people of a lower social status into the Royal Navy as officers via the officer training program, it started out and then it kind of varied. Basically, when people who were more progressive, like Corbett or Fisher, took their eye off the ball, then it started to backslide, and then when they put their eye back on it, it progressed again. And so, by the time Churchill becomes First Sea Lord, it's entirely possible he took a look at it and basically reinvigorated the program, but he was not the originator of it. Texas Anne LaChoc asks, can you tell us a little about Joe Fowler, a US Navy Rear Admiral and Disney legend who was brought in by Walt Disney as a consultant on the Mark Twain and eventually oversaw the construction of the Disney parks? His official D23 page says he was involved in several designs, including the Lexingtons. Can you expand on that a bit? In naval terms, Admiral Fowler, although obviously he wasn't an admiral at the start, born in 1894, joined the US Navy during the 1910s and started off his career in submarines. But in the aftermath of World War I, as an early submarine officer, and particularly officer in particular, he went over to MIT, got a master's degree in naval architecture, and that made him very useful to the US Navy, which at the time was still in the business, as were most other navies, of designing and building their own ships rather than getting third parties to do it. And that meant he was able to be a part of the design teams on numerous different types of vessels. That included everything from small gunboats that you would see used on various rivers in the Far East, all the way up to being an integral part of the team that worked on the conversion of the battle cruisers Saratoga and Lexington into the aircraft carriers Saratoga and Lexington. And then later on, although he spent most of his time on the West Coast, He was also at one point in charge of Portsmouth Naval Yard's submarine construction. Portsmouth Navy Yard being, of course, in Maine, which is on the US East Coast, but sooner or later he would end up back on the West Coast again. And during World War II, he appears to have played some role in the supervision of ship construction on the West Coast shipyards. So things like the Kaiser shipyard building all those Casablanca-class escort carriers and so on and so forth. But in the post-World War II reductions, he retired out of the Navy, although he was then sort of brought back out of retirement, but not necessarily entirely straight into the naval chain of command to help out the Truman administration, but still being based out in the West Coast. That's where Walt Disney came across him and essentially brought him into the Disney company, and he started his Disney career, which is a separate matter entirely. So his career path was mostly shore-based in terms of naval architecture, construction, and administration, as opposed to the mostly sea-based careers of people like Admiral Lee or Admiral Wolsey. Greb asks, since I've read the US Navy had a 3-inch dual-purpose mount, I was wondering, what is the smallest caliber you think would be an effective dual-purpose mount for the main batteries of destroyers and the secondary batteries of other ships? If you're going to make it the main battery of your destroyers and the secondary of your capital ships, then I think realistically the smallest effective dual-purpose caliber is probably going to be the 4-inch. You can see here a twin 4-inch on HMS Glasgow acting as a secondary on obviously a town-class cruiser. But anything smaller than that and you're going to run into some issues. I mean, 3-inch, sure, is still pretty good at being long-range heavy AA. Obviously, it's not going to go quite as far as a 4, 4.5, 5 or 5.25 inch, but it'll go a reasonable distance and it can have a proximity fuse. But a 3-inch gun, certainly by the time that dual-purpose batteries are coming in World War II, will be outranged and significantly outpowered by 4, 4.5, 5-inch and other related caliber weapons, which are the primary battery of almost all destroyers. In fact, even the 4-inch gun is relatively uncommon as the main battery on all but the smallest and oldest destroyers by World War II. So a ship armed with 3-inch guns could just be outranged and outshot by a ship with significantly heavier guns. Whereas the 4-inch, as I say, although it is on the smaller side of things, the 4-inch is still large enough to be an effective long-range anti-aircraft gun. And in comparison to a 4.7 or 5 or 5.25 inch, it is quite light, which is the big thing. So to give you some idea, the average twin 5-inch mount is coming in at around about 50 to 60 tons for a 5-inch 38 in World War II, whereas the average twin 4-inch mount, which, as I say, you can see an example of here, is coming in at around 16 to 18 tons, and some of them a little bit less, which means that for the weight of a average single 5-inch 38 twin mount, you could, weight-wise at least, for the mountings, fit 3 twin 4-inch. Now, of course, that's not necessarily going to be a perfect comparison because 3 twin 4s will take up a lot more deck space than a single twin 5-inch 38, and you've got to take into account the magazines and shell hoists and all of that kind of stuff as well. But the general point is that if you are using a twin 4, then your main restriction is deck space, not weight. And that in turn usually means you can fit a lot more of them, which means that their one big weakness, which is going to be the lack of stopping power against surface vessels, can be compensated for by sheer weight of firepower. Now, obviously, ideally, a lot of navies would prefer that their secondary batteries could cripple an incoming destroyer with 1 or 2 hits. By World War II with a 4-inch, that's probably not going to happen. But the flip side to that is that if you take a destroyer like, say, a Sumner or a Gearing that has 3 twin 5-inch, so 6 guns total, if you played around a little bit with the design, you could probably quite easily fit 5 twin 4-inch for a 10-gun total on the same hull. And similarly, you could probably get, instead of, say, a 10-gun broadside using 5-inch 38s or an 8-gun broadside with 5.25s, well, you could get a 10-gun broadside with 4.5s on ships that were generally a little bit smaller than the Iowas. But if you went with a twin 4, considering you could get a 6-gun broadside on a 10,000-ton or just over 10,000-ton town class like HMS Belfast, if you scale it up to larger vessels and look at maybe something like what they did with Jean Bart post-war, you could get 12, 14, 16, maybe even 18-gun broadsides using the twin 4 on a treaty-era battleship, which would mean that you could smother an incoming destroyer in many hits, which would be quite useful. So I think, yeah, roughly a 4-inch is about the smallest effective dual purpose you could get. Mike Lima 777 asks, spotter aircraft were used to assist cruisers and capital ships with aiming at long distances. How did this work? What information is provided by the aircraft to the parent ship? Bearing, fall of shot, and did they use radio triangulation to determine a firing solution? They didn't use radio triangulation. The technology wasn't anywhere near close enough to be accurate to the level that would be needed, but essentially, the purpose of aerial recon full of shot, at least for sea battles, land battles is a slightly different matter, although related, as in shore bombardment. But in sea battles, the problem was that if you fired your shells at a target that was a very long way away, not only would the fall of shot be rather difficult to determine, just because even with magnification through telescopes and binoculars and so forth, it would still be pretty small, but also the depth perception involved would be reduced. So up close, like you can see with this salvo, it's pretty easy to tell that the second from left shell has landed significantly further behind where most of the other shells have landed. But if you downscale this to a much, much smaller amount, and then you put it all on the horizon, where you've got less relative bearing of the depth of the sea from your perspective, because the vertical angle is considerably smaller, all you can really see is that if you're lucky and you've straddled the enemy, whether the shells are ahead or behind them, determining exactly how far is quite difficult and open to inaccuracy. And if you've missed the target by bearing as well as by distance, then working out whether you went short or long can be quite difficult as well. Whereas obviously with an aircraft up in the sky, he's got a lot of vertical angle involved, so he can see much more clearly and with much greater accuracy where those shells have landed, also because he's just physically closer. So what they aircraft would call out would be the fall of shot relative to the target, because obviously in theory you're aiming at the target and the aircraft can see which way the target is going, bow and stern, etc. So then if the shells have landed, say, 500 yards forward of the target, well, the rangefinder and other spotting equipment on the ship might be able to tell that has happened. But the aircraft can also tell them, well, actually, you were also 600 yards over, which would be much more difficult to determine on the ship. And, of course, it's a separate set of eyes that's doing all the spotting as well. So then you say, okay, right, well, if that's the case, let's move the guns down 600 and fire, and then hopefully you will be on target. The other thing that aerial spotting can also report is the enemy evading, because obviously they can see the wake of the enemy ship very clearly and its relative bearing to where it was previously going, based on, again, the wake of the ship trailing behind it. So they can advise you of course changes and exactly what amount of course change has been made quite accurately, again, compared to trying to look at it, a ship basically horizontally at 15-20 miles distance. Robert Henry Ilston asks, the Chieftain talks about the ergonomics of the various tanks he goes through in his Inside the Hatch series, and makes a point on how some are just better because the crew doesn't have to fight the tank. Sticking with World War II, are there certain vessels, nations, ship types, etc. that have better crew ergonomics than others, and which ones stand out, and what other surprises have you found? To a certain extent, yes, although looking at preserved museum ships can be a little bit misleading because, of course, ships, whilst they are generally built to roughly similar specs in terms of size of crew quarters, size of corridors, etc. They are also built to a certain extent to accommodate equipment that for a specific navy that needs to be passed through, and also the average size of the sailor, which might differ nation to nation and decade to decade, although design trends in that respect tend to take somewhat longer to get influence than just a decade or two. But also ships get continually refitted. So if you go on HMS Belfast, for example, these days, if you're anything over 6 foot, you're going to spend most of your time wandering the decks with your head cranked to one side or in a stoop, because otherwise you're going to smack your head into a load of things. So you might think, well, ergonomically, this is a terrible ship to serve on. But for World War II, you'd be incorrect, because the reason you're having to duck your head most of the time is because of a bunch of air ducts that were put in during her Cold War refit to make portions of her NBC proof, and they just sort of stuck that on top of everything else that was already up on the ceilings, and thus that gives you a slightly false impression. Obviously, if you were over 6 foot and you were on HMS Belfast in the late 50s and early 60s, it would be a bit of a problem, but not in the Second World War, and certainly not as she was designed. The reason the 5.25 inch is the picture for this particular item is because the circular 5.25 inch turret, as found on the Didos and the King George V's, was notoriously ergonomically uncomfortable. A good chunk of the reason why the 5.25 on those ships didn't quite reach the rates of fire that testing had shown it could was because the turret ergonomics and just overall internal size were pretty poor, which is one of the reasons why you see a kind of octagonal version pop up on Vanguard, which solves a good chunk of those problems. And then, of course, you have ships that are built to certain specifications, either because they need to be built quickly because of wartime, or they need to be built really small because they need lots of ships cheaply. And that's when you end up with sort of very cramped vessels where perhaps there's too many people and not enough space, and so on and so forth. But it's a very variable thing, because often ships that are derided as being really bad ships to serve in, like, say, a Crown Colony class in the middle of the Pacific at the end of World War II, might, in earlier times when they're first commissioned, so they don't have quite as many supplementary crew for radar and anti-aircraft guns, etc., or in peacetime when a lot of those crew are not present, and then it's serving the North Atlantic or the Northern Pacific, where all those heating systems are now coming into play, might suddenly turn out to be a really popular ship to serve on. So a lot of the time, many of the ergonomic factors are highly dependent on the level of overcrowding in the ship, which you can only to a certain extent design for, and what climate it's actually serving in the first place. Bill Luster asks, one of my first museum ships was USS Cairo at Vicksburg. What do you think about preserving the remains of a sunken vessel like it versus restoring it to near enough original condition? Are there other lost warships you might raise and present similarly? I think there's a very fine balance that needs to be struck, and it can be difficult because whilst it is obviously in theory ideal to preserve whatever the ship is in the state that you've got it in, I preserve the original vessel, you also have to acknowledge that if you are going to do so, unless you have a very, very, very generous government to supply lots of funds, you kind of need to attract paying visitors. And with the best will in the world, what was left of Cairo was probably not enough in and of itself to attract all that many visitors. So what they've done was, you can see here, with this kind of partial restoration where they put the original wreck in a framework, and then that framework has been embellished with a few additional bits and pieces to give you perhaps a better idea of what the ship looked like originally. That's certainly one approach, presenting the wreck in its context, which I think works pretty well. And they've done a similar, if not identical, approach with the Mary Rose, although they haven't built the other half of the Mary Rose and kind of matched it up. What they have done is they've taken a lot of the finds and they've put the finds in kind of a mirror image on the levels in the museum, so that you can see where the guns would have been positioned, where the bows would have been positioned, etc., etc., assuming the perfect mirror matching on the ship, which is near enough as makes no difference. So that means you can preserve all the original artifacts whilst giving people a better idea of what they would have been like on the ship without, straining the several hundred-year-old ship by actually putting a bunch of bronze and iron guns back onto it. But then there are other approaches like have been taken with, say, the Great Britain or the Warrior, where the ships have come in as essentially floating wrecks, or in the case of Great Britain, not even technically floating, but they've been heavily restored back to something approximating their original condition. And the same thing actually with the Hungarian monitor SMS Leitha, or Leiter. It was at the end of its life a rusting crane ship, but it's been converted back into a monitor with various forms of restoration. But then, of course, if you are going to restore a ship, if that ship's had any kind of extensive career, you have to decide what period you're going to restore the ship back to. Are you going to restore it to how it looked originally? Are you going to restore it to how it looked in its heyday? Are you going to restore it to how it looked in perhaps a particularly notable event in its career? And with the Cairo obviously having a relatively short career, that doesn't make much odds. You just put it back to how it was, because that's pretty much that's its only real configuration, but there you go. So I think how much you're going to restore the ship pretty much depends very heavily on a case-by-case basis. If you've only got large fragments of the ship, I think at least a partial Cairo-like reconstruction where you keep the new stuff and the old stuff separate but intermixed is probably at least the minimum way to go. And a lot of it also depends on funding, to be perfectly honest, because, say, for example, take the Newport ship, a 14th century trade vessel that was found, unsurprisingly, off of Newport in Wales, and that's in bits. I don't think there's even as much of it as we have of the Mary Rose, but at the same time, a 14th century trade vessel is even smaller than the Mary Rose, and to the general public, somewhat less interesting because it's not covered in guns and bows and all sorts of other things. So in that case, if there was, unlimited funding, what I might do with that is to have the original on display, but then perhaps build the museum onto a wharf or quay and have a partially enclosed or gated dock that's part of the museum, and then maybe get a replica of the ship built. So you go through a museum, you see the original with all the artifacts and the explanations about it, and then you can go aboard the replica to find out what that would have been like if you'd actually been on board the thing. Blanche asks, could you give an intro to human torpedoes? Who used them and when? How effective were they? Are there any interesting examples of their use, and do you already have a video on them? Well, there are two main strands of development, at least for the period the channel covers, for human torpedoes, or human manned torpedoes, if you like, which is essentially the British and Italian versions, the Italians getting there first, and the Japanese version, which as you might anticipate, was a bit more suicidal. So the difference between a manned torpedo or a human torpedo and a very small submarine can be somewhat academic, but generally speaking, if the base unit that's being used as the foundation of your equipment is, or at some point at least was, a torpedo, that's a pretty good indication. The only other thing that I think you roughly put your thumb on would be if you have divers riding the thing, then it is closer to being a manned torpedo than a mini sub, whereas if the crew are inside a structure that has pressure and air, etc., then it's more likely you are aboard a miniature sub, even if that sub doesn't have a torpedo of its own to fire. So, for example, the X-craft are very definitely miniature subs. The Chariot, the British human torpedo, and the Maiale, the Italian human torpedo, are very definitely human torpedoes. The Kai-10 is kind of right on the edge, but since it's based on an actual torpedo, I'm going to put it in the human torpedo category as well. So that gives you an idea of who was using them and when. The Italians got there first, then the British, and then finally the Japanese. In terms of effectiveness, it depends really on what they're used for. Both the Italian and British versions were essentially sabotage units, what we would today call special forces or spec ops units, designed to go after anchored craft. And they had varying degrees of success. The Italians famously got quite a lot of success off of Gibraltar. They, of course, got Queen Elizabeth and Valiant. Although they didn't sink them, they did manage to cripple them and put them out of the war for a good long while. But equally, there were times when the 10th Flotilla, which was the Italian Underwater Special Forces lot, tried to use their human torpedoes, and either a combination of British defences or technological limitations meant that those efforts failed, either before or after their detachment from their motherships. And similarly with the British chariots, sometimes they were successful and sometimes they weren't, but given the relatively speaking low cost of investment compared to the rewards of what they might cripple or destroy, you could say overall they were pretty effective. The Japanese Kai-10 suicide human torpedoes, whereas so with the British and the Italian ones, the idea was this was a vehicle to get you to your target. You then either left the entire unit or detached a portion of it to function as the explosive, and then you left while the explosive was on a timer, whereas the Kai-10 was essentially, we have put a gigantic warhead on a torpedo body, which is also almost a mini sub body, and then put a person in it to act as essentially a organic guidance system, and then it hits the ship and explodes, and it's designed to be targeted as much at moving vessels as it is stationary ones. So a very different use case, but also not particularly effective. They did get a few hits, but compared to the much more extensive cost, as I said, of essentially turning a already large torpedo into almost a small mini sub, the number fired compared to the number that actually did any damage, and the overall cost of conversion and the risk the launching craft, whether that be a submarine or a surface vessel, put itself at, the Kai-10s were not anywhere near as effective, either on a cost basis or on a vessel's damage basis, as the Maiale and the chariots. I don't have a specific video on any of these, but I do have a video on mini-subs. I do have a video on the 10th Flotilla, the Italian Special Forces, which does cover their use of Maiale. I haven't done anything specific about the chariots or the Kai-10 yet, although I have mentioned them in passing. Sapper Ninja asks, the account of Captain Johan Lindemann from the mail steamer Gouverneur General Loudon was very useful in understanding the Krakatoa eruption and helped found the study of volcanology. Are there any other notable cases where serendipity or unfortunate-fortunate accident meant that a ship has accidentally contributed to science? Well, there are quite a few instances. The ships that went through Typhoon Cobra, for example, they contributed quite a lot to the understanding of weather prediction, especially when it came to very strong weather systems in the Western Pacific. Not that that helps people with Typhoon Connie-Viper the next year, but long term there's been a lot of benefit that's come out of that. Additionally, some ships that went aground, they contributed to the understanding of the sciences of currents and riptides, and even if it's just things like simple, oh, there's an uncharted rock here that we didn't know about before. Plus, you can have ships that are blown across oceans by storms, which helps understand the path of storms, wind and waves, and even, phenomena such as eclipses and meteors and various other stellar phenomena that a ship might be uniquely positioned to observe purely by chance, although as the age of exploration went on, they often would deliberately send ships to set up observatories at the best locations if they knew such a thing was coming. So yeah, there's a lot of different examples where ships have accidentally contributed to the advancement of science by witnessing things that people on land either couldn't or didn't survive. But whilst we're on the subject, I think at some point in the future I do have to make a short video about Captain Johan Lindemann and his ship, because it is one of the very, very rare examples for me of reading about or watching something that will leave you choked up repeatedly, even if you know what's going to happen, no matter how many times you read it. It's a fairly rare phenomenon for me. One of the other ones is Londo's speech in the beginning, one of the Babylon 5 direct-to-video movies. But this guy, you really need to look up what he did, because there were a fair number of ships in the region of Krakatoa, the big volcano, when it erupted, and a lot of captains did the best that they could but made the wrong call, and some of them, that meant the ship ended up miles inland with everybody aboard dead. Whereas, admittedly, he had a Victorian Clyde built iron ship, so a pretty solid thing in the first place, but he realized something really bad was going on, and contrary to most people, when you have a volcanic eruption that is turned day to night and is dropping enough ash that it's going to capsize the ship unless you have like half the crew on deck shoveling it over the side continuously, he decided, actually, I think we should take the ship out to sea. And then when Krakatoa really let go, you got this, which obviously this is a depiction that you can see in a documentary that was done about the explosion. But this is one of the few times that, Hollywood CGI doesn't need to exaggerate, because it was literally a wall of water. Not like most regular tsunamis, even in the deep sea, because it was essentially formed by the collapse of the Krakatoa caldera. You would just have this onrushing mass of water that would go on to smash everything before it and kill tens of thousands of people. These days, the death toll would be in the tens of millions, if not more. But as you can see from that little light there, center right of your screen, he decided to drop his anchors, not to anchor the ship in place, but actually to act more as a form of impromptu sea anchor, and then turned his ship out full speed straight into the tsunami and essentially rode it like he was on a giant surfboard up the tsunami and over the top and down the other side. The ship held together, he held together, and everybody on board survived. It was a absolutely phenomenal act of seamanship and heroism, because he basically ordered pretty much everybody else below decks. There were very, very few, if any, people apart from himself above deck, and obviously he was on the bridge steering, tied himself to the ship so that he wouldn't be washed away. And he saved everybody's lives through colossal amounts of courage and skill. And I think absolutely needs to be remembered considerably more than he is as a hero of the maritime world. Oh dear, Fisher has renamed himself. So Farragut, Farragut's Frog Gut Forger, Foraging for 4 Forgotten Frog Guts for 4 Frog Gut Friar Fair, I think, asks, what is the first US ship that you believe could confidently defeat a contemporary outfit of HMS Warrior in an even gunfight, minus gimmicky weapons like torpedo rams and so forth? And also, what was the first US equivalent to Warrior in terms of capability? Bearing in mind these may not be the same ships. The first approximate equivalent to HMS Warrior was USS New Ironsides, which was actually laid down pretty shortly after Warrior and then launched, in as much as she's the first US seagoing ironclad. However, although she is broadly the US equivalent, she is not, in my opinion, capable of taking on Warrior one-on-one with any degree of confidence in victory. She's a considerably smaller vessel, she's considerably slower, and she carries significantly fewer guns. Now, admittedly, she does carry a reasonably significant battery of 11-inch Dahlgrens, but as I've established in various other dry docks before, the 11-inch Dahlgren does not really have the capacity at any realistic range during pretty much the entirety of the US Civil War period of penetrating the armoured portions of HMS Warrior, and even post American Civil War or the late American Civil War, once they've got into producing steel shot and they've upped the charges to the maximum that the gun turns out can actually take, even then that would require the New Ironsides to be pretty close to Warrior, and Warrior, as I said, is bigger and faster and can just stay at range if it needs to, and its Warrior 68-pounders are more than capable of dealing with USS New Ironsides, considering that she is a wooden-hulled ironclad, kind of like, in some ways, an American version of Gloire. But if you're talking about a US ironclad that could confidently, 60-40 or better defeat HMS Warrior in standard operational conditions without gimmicks, it gets quite difficult, to be perfectly honest, for two reasons. One, there's a huge gap in US Navy ironclad building. Basically, they build the American Civil War era monitors, and then they don't really build anything else that's ironclad afterwards for about a decade. So if you go forward a decade from the American Civil War, 15 or so years from HMS Warrior, you get the honestly a refit of the old planned ship USS Puritan, which is in fact a brand new ship. So yeah, the 1874 ordered but commissioned 1896 USS Puritan, unsurprisingly, could beat HMS Warrior quite handily, albeit Warrior could still outsail it, believe it or not. The problem is, if you want to go back before the honestly I'm a refit Puritan, then, well, the Milwaukee class, which I've covered recently, sorry, I'm not seeing that. So you're essentially down to the last generation seagoing monitors. So the Dictator, the Miantonoma class, I think, and the Kalamazoo class. In theory, they do carry the guns that would be capable of penetrating Warrior's armour at something approaching a reasonable, albeit still somewhat close, battle range. But whilst they are officially classed as seagoing monitors, they are still considerably slower than Warrior, and they're going to be much less capable in a seaway than Warrior, and they have a rather hilariously slow rate of fire thanks to their 15-inch Dahlgrens, which means that although their turret armour is enough to withstand the 68-pounders and 110-pounders on Warrior, the simple fact is Warrior can either refuse the engagement, outside again of special shenanigans like forcing a coastal engagement where one side or the other can't get away, or Warrior can still sit at range and bombard the monitors with considerable amounts of incoming fire and potentially cripple them that way, which, although it wouldn't necessarily breach their armour, could cause enough damage to render the monitor incapable of fighting, which did happen a number of times in monitor versus monitor engagements during the US Civil War. Or, to be perfectly honest, Warrior is big enough, mean enough, and fast enough to just ram them, or ram and board them. So, whilst the perhaps not Dictator because it's only got a single turret, but the twin 15-inch turret monitors, so the Miantonomas and Kalamazoos, they'd stand a decent fighting chance if Warrior chose to engage. But even then, I'd struggle to say confidently they'd win 60-40 or more. There's a lot of ways that Warrior could pull off a win against those ships, and it's literally, with the last of the Kalamazoos, you're then just waiting for Puritan in the 1890s, which seems a bit of a cheat. Matt Kidd asks, was there much of a difference in capability between the Gato, Balao, and Tench class submarines? Yes and no. So there are enough differences for them to be distinct classes, but at the same time, the designs are incremental enough that quite often some of the features that are locked in to a new design can be found in some of the last ships of the old design. So, for example, trying to distinguish the capabilities of one of the last few Balaos to be built compared to one of the first Tenches can be a bit of a difficulty, because one of the bigger features of the Tench class was considerably extended range due to additional fuel tanks, but some of the later Balaos had those fitted as well. But broadly speaking, the Balao class, its main improvement over the Gato class was, as I mentioned actually earlier in this Drydock, a thicker hull, therefore an increased diving depth and better resistance to damage. And the Tench class's main features over most of the Balaos was the extended range, as I mentioned before, but also it could carry a few more torpedoes, which meant that not only could it stay out on patrol for longer, but it had more things to shoot at the enemy. Almost everything else in terms of periscopes, torpedo data computers, deck guns, etc., 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 batteries even. All of these things were equally capable of being applied as improvements to previous subs, and quite often were. And as a result, you could end up with, say, a Gato class that had just been refitted in late 1944, early 1945, and that might actually have, in terms of some of that equipment I just listed, more capabilities, sonar as well, than, say, an early Balao, which hadn't yet gone in for a major refit. So, whilst there are a few key differences, which we've highlighted, there are a lot of smaller differences which you will find basically vary on a sub-by-sub and a year-by-year basis. W. Swordsman asks, how well would battleship armour hold up to getting hit in essentially the same spot multiple times when the first round doesn't pierce the armour? I'm thinking something like a 6 or 8 inch shell from a cruiser hits a battleship at decent battle range, and then a short time later the same spot is hit again. If we're assuming battleship belt armour, so something that's 12 to 16 inches in thickness, in the particular scenario you're positing, it's going to hold up pretty well, because a 6-inch shell certainly is going to do almost nothing to a battleship's main belt if it hits. It might cause a bit of scorching and a little bit of a dent, but you'd be lucky to even do that. Whereas, okay, an 8-inch, well, you can look at some of the 8-inch impacts on various bits of armour on Bismarck. Yeah, it'll carve out a bit of a divot, but again, it's not going to hugely trouble the armour. The thing is, armour penetration by shells, not apart from the fact that the lot of 6-inch and 8-inch shells on cruisers weren't fully armour-piercing anyway, a lot of them were semi-armour-piercing, but even if we assume that we are using armour-piercing shells, the penetration of a shell that notionally is twice as large, so a 12-inch or a 16-inch shell, depending on which of the two cruiser grades you're looking at, is exponentially more. So it's not a case of, well, the 8-inch shell is half the size of a 16-inch shell, so it'll do half the damage. It's an 8-inch shell volumetrically is tiny compared to a 16-inch shell, and therefore the amount of damage it's going to do is a small fraction. Now, if you were talking about, say, a Des Moines class's super heavy 8-inch shells, and if they're using the armour-piercing variant, and they're shooting at something relatively lightly protected, like, say, 12-inch belt armour, or, well, there were 1 or 2 battleships floating around in World War II with even less, but let's go with 12-inch, then a couple of hits on exactly the same spot, you might, in my rough estimation, cause some spalling damage to the inside, but even then, penetration at reasonable battle ranges is relatively unlikely. Now, compare that to a hit from a full-on battleship shell. I know that's not the question that you asked, but for comparison purposes, a battleship shell that at reasonable battle ranges that has failed to deflect off of, or failed to penetrate a main armor belt, will still have caused some fairly extensive damage to the outer layers, possibly even some spooling damage, but certainly a degree of significant damage to the outer layers, which are the hardened layers. So a armor-piercing battleship grade shell that hits the exact same spot will probably almost certainly go through, because the resistive power of that outer face will have been very heavily compromised. The Hand of Ray asks, what are some of your favourite never-built designs from World of Warships? Well, when you're playing World of Warships, a lot of your appreciation for the ships is going to be tied up in gameplay or in some other manner of your direct interaction with them. So some of my favourite ones are Plymouth, as you can see here, and Minotaur. I really like playing with those ships. Gasconia, partly because I like playing with it, partly also because I just start singing off-key, the Gaston song from Beauty and the Beast, just relabeled for Gasconia with some very odd lyrics. There's Anhalt, I think it's pronounced, from the German line, which is just hilarious to me. I just love the sheer craziness of the number of turrets that thing has as a capital ship. I really like the Georgia, the twin 18-inch armed Tier 9 US battleship. The Florida, because it's a pretty much spot-on perfect rendition of what the North Carolina class would have been, barring a few last-minute changes. And, well, if you've seen as of the time that this video's gone out, the previous Wednesday's video, you'll understand where that's coming from. And, you know, the list goes on with ships like this. So generally it's a case of it either has to amuse me greatly or I have to greatly enjoy playing it, and then I like it as a never-built ship in the game. I'm aiming to try and get Hector as well, because I play-tested it and it was really cool, but it's currently a research-only vessel for the Commonwealth, so that's the K-25 hilarious number of guns Dido upgrade variant. So yeah, those are some of my favourite never-built designs from World of Warships. Oh, and of course, can't go without mentioning Duncan, aka the G3. It's every bit as lethal as its real-life counterpart would probably have been. John McDonough asks, Robert L. O'Connell in Of Arms and Men contends that Jackie Fisher and John Hawkins essentially came up with the same idea, a fast, big gun ship that can kill anything it can catch and run from what it can't kill, only separated by 300 years. Is this a fair assessment? In some ways, it's kind of fair, but I would disagree with it in others. Now, of course, there is the fact that in the time of Hawkins, you don't have armour, whereas in Fisher's time you do, which does influence whether or not a ship is supposed to stay in the battle line. And there are some subtle differences even there, disregarding armour, in as much as the battle cruiser is supposed to hunt down enemy commerce, raiders, and potentially even commerce, although less likely, and then form a fleet screen for the main battle line, and then potentially supplement the battle line in a chase, whereas the race-built galleon, in as much as the battle line exists at all at the time of the Armada, it is the battle line. Is essentially, so it is both battleship and battle cruiser at the same time. So in some ways you could argue maybe that the race-built galleon is supposed to be the fast battleship. Of course, with the big threat of boarding, it doesn't want to get too close, but boarding actions, again, in the 20th century, in full action between capital ships, are not really going to be a thing. But I think that's one of my main objections, the fact that battle cruiser is not the battle line, the race-built galleon is. Another thing is that because of their speed, it was accepted, generally speaking, that battle cruisers would not be the world's most maneuverable vessels, whereas, as you've seen in the Armada videos, English race-built galleons were notorious for their agility and their ability to outmaneuver their opponents. So there are some key differences, I think, although weirdly, perhaps, one way in which you might say they're more similar than not is that, of course, the race-built galleon went on to supplant the towering galleon, and both in terms of its hull form and in terms of its main objective of gunnery versus boarding when it comes to future vessels. So future warships basically descend from the race-built galleon in the Western world as opposed to the Spanish galleon, and is, in some ways, you could argue potentially that the post-Washington battleships kind of have a same relationship with the battle cruiser, because when you look at, well, the Japanese trying to integrate the battle cruiser and the battleship in their 1920s designs, okay, we'll quietly ignore the Lexingtons for the minute, but the US was desperately trying to redesign them anyway. And then you look at something like the G3s. The G3s have substantial protection, high speed, and substantial firepower, whereas something like the N3s has an awful lot of firepower and protection, but is, relatively speaking, slow. And then once you come to the other end of the interwar period, and you get the King George V, the North Carolinas, etc., what you see is ships being laid down which have considerable speed relative to the older battleships, still a good amount of protection, and a decent amount of firepower. Indeed, if you just look at purely on paper stats and you look at a G3 and an Iowa, their design characteristics are actually remarkably similar on paper. So you could, I suppose, in theory, argue that between things like the G3, the Amagi, and Hood, that perhaps the modern fast battleship is more a descendant of the late World War I-early 1920s battlecruiser than it is the late 1920s, early 1920s battleships with things like the South Dakotas and N3s. But I do admit that is something that could be argued quite extensively. Dr. D.M. Platt asks, you recently discussed a Midway for Yorktown swap in 1941. How would a one-for-one swap of the Malta class for the Illustrious class from 1940 impact the actions of the Royal Navy? Now, this is going to make quite a substantial difference. I mean, as I said before, with the Midways, Yorktowns, there's still going to be a fairly substantial difference there, but the Maltas are even more of a game changer for the Royal Navy than the Midways would be for the US, because the Midways are essentially, the same idea as Yorktown with a only slightly larger air group, obviously considerably better protection. So they're not necessarily incremental because you've got the Essexes in between, but the US would be relatively familiar with how to do everything that they've done with the Yorktowns, just they can do a bit more. Whereas with the Maltas, you have the ability to warm up aircraft below decks, which isn't present on the Illustriouses. That's a big game changer. You've still got the armoured flight deck. In fact, it's even thicker now than it was on the Illustriouses, so you've still got a good amount of protection. Of course, you have all the latest and greatest in radar-directed anti-aircraft fire, which is going to be hugely helpful when it comes to operating in the Mediterranean especially. And the difference in the number and type of aircraft you can operate is absolutely huge. The Maltas can operate something in the region of about 3 to 4 times as many aircraft, depending on exactly which measures you're looking at and which aircraft you're operating, but about 3 to 4 times as many aircraft as an Illustrious can. That's a massive game changer for the Royal Navy, to say nothing of if it comes with aircraft from the time that the Maltas theoretically would have been in service. You'd be talking about last generation Seafires, Westland Wivens, Hawker Sea Furies, de Havilland Sea Hornets. That would be an absolutely huge switch up from Swordfish, Albacores and Fulmars. But even without the aircraft, the fact that you can just pack so many onto a Malta would be absolutely huge. I mean, think about the pedestal runs. Even if you're restricted to Fulmars, and you may not be, because such as a substantially larger carrier might make getting Sea Hurricanes and Seafires into service a bit faster, considerably easier. But even with just Fulmars and Sea Hurricanes, being able to throw dozens and dozens of them onto Operation Pedestal, Operation Vigorous, etc., would badly disrupt Axis attack efforts. And as the war progresses, conversion of two-seaters like the Sea Mosquito, which historically did happen later on in the war, might happen earlier because you can easily operate them off of a Malta. Of course, if they are damaged, i.e. the Axis forces manage to break through even its substantially improved defences and cause damage, it is going to be a lot harder to repair. But the sheer amount of power that a Malta can put out relative to an Illustrious is a huge, huge game changer. I mean, imagine, Taranto, where instead of operating with just under 24 Swordfish, a Malta could, if the Royal Navy can even find enough Swordfish, could easily lob 60 plus Swordfish at the Italians and still have substantial amounts of fighters on deck to defend itself later on. And similarly, Matapan, instead of the British sending little penny packets of torpedo bombers out to try and slow down the Italians, you can send out almost sky-darkening numbers of aircraft. And again, similarly, if Victorious is replaced by a Malta, then when Victorious goes to launch her strike on Bismarck, there's going to be a lot more than a few handfuls of Swordfish going after it, and so on and so on. Kra F1 asks, who was the Blue Admiral in US Navy Fleet Problem 8 who used towing, tides and currents to boost his fleet's otherwise slow speed and slip past the Orange Fleet? What impact did his actions have on Fleet Problem 8 and what impact did his overall career have on the US Navy? That admiral was Admiral Louis R. de Steiger, I think that's how it's pronounced anyway. And in terms of its immediate impact on Fleet Problem 8, well, as I covered in the video in question, he actually managed to completely bypass the Orange Fleet that was supposed to be stopping him from reaching Hawaii. So Blue Fleet just rocked up uncontested to Hawaii based on Orange having no idea where they were. They just kind of went around them, which, a little bit embarrassing, and showed that you really, really, really don't want to underestimate what your opponent is capable of. In terms of his overall career in the US Navy, well, he was actually towards the end of his career when the Fleet Problem 8 was held. He then went on to command the Brooklyn Naval Yard shortly thereafter, and then retired in 1932. So obviously that would then be the end of his direct influence on the US Navy. He wasn't, as far as I can tell, recalled to command in World War II. He was probably, well, at that point he would have been quite old. He would have been almost 10 years in retirement. But as far as indirect impacts on the US Navy, he seems to have had a reputation as someone who was incredibly tight on discipline, but also not in any way, shape or form a by-the-book admiral. So quite a number of officers, including one or two who actually reached very high rank, like CNO, who served under him, said was the effect of, although it's not necessarily an experience they'd like to repeat, their service did teach them a lot of very valuable lessons. Brian Smith asks, I know this would be at the end of the time the channel covers, but after just seeing Oppenheimer, I know the US Army had nuclear shells, but did any Navy acknowledge they had nuclear shells for any of their capital ships? As far as I know, the only Navy that's ever acknowledged nuclear shells for its capital ships was the US Navy, with the Mark 23 or W-23 nuclear shell, which you can see here, which was obviously a 16-inch shell designed for the Iowa class, although in a slightly weird turn of events, by the time there were any substantial number of them built, the Iowas, which had mostly been recommissioned for the Korean War, were now all back in reserve, and these shells only seem to have stayed in the US inventory for, I think, 7 or 8 years, which meant that by the time USS New Jersey recommissioned in the late 60s, they were already back out of service. So you had this kind of weird dichotomy of the US Navy having several dozen 16-inch nuclear shells for its battleships, but no battleships actually in service to use them until well after the time the shells had been taken back out of service again. As far as everyone else is concerned, well, the only other people with battleship of any description or capital ship lying around after World War II for any substantial amount of time were the British, and as we know, Vanguard went out of service in the late 50s, so they didn't develop any nuclear shells for her, as far as I know, and I'm pretty sure they didn't. And I'm definitely sure that Turkey didn't develop any nuclear shells for the 11-inch guns of Yavuz Sultan Selim. Matt Blom asks, how was gunpowder handled during battle in an Age of Sail first rate? Was the powder kept close to the guns, and did it cause issues such as with World War I British battlecruisers, or how else was powder brought from the magazine to the guns? So it varied slightly depending on ships. Some ships had a single main magazine, which was almost always lined with copper, or if not with some other non-sparking material, with a kind of not quite airlock, but interlock, I guess you could call it, to make sure there were no sparks or embers on somebody's clothing coming in. Actually, they were quite sophisticated in the way that they safeguarded their powder stores, and all of this was below the waterline. The reason I say it varied is that some ships did also have secondary magazines distributed elsewhere on the ship to make access to powder slightly easier than having to run the full length of the ship if your gun happened to be at the far end. And then when gunpowder was required, you would have members of the crew, sometimes termed powder monkeys, because small, agile, fast children were quite useful for this kind of role, and they would have to go down and retrieve charges of gunpowder from the magazines and bring them up to the guns, which would then fire them. But also bear in mind that the idea of, 50-odd young boys, and sometimes older men or women who might be aboard the ship, tearing up and down ladders constantly in some kind of explosive relay race is a little bit inaccurate, because we do have surviving accounts from various ships of lines in varying nations, And it seems that it was a little bit more organised than that. So you'd effectively get a gunpowder version of a bucket brigade where a certain number of people would be filing into and out the magazine, bringing the charges out, but then they would pass the charges up in a continuous line of people who would be waiting on various decks and perhaps even on the access ladders and so forth. And that would actually speed up the distribution of gunpowder quite significantly. And there'd be short intervals where people might be going up and down something or across a certain space. But given that even a 32-pounder gun needs less than 10 pounds of powder to fire, you could carry several charges at once. And then obviously as the charges reach higher and higher in the ship, there's fewer and fewer of them. They get distributed along the various guns. So you might have, say, some running parties on a gun deck, and they would run to a hatch where there would be a small party of people who'd be receiving charges up the hatch, who'd distribute them to the runners on that deck. And then there'd be, as I said, a sort of a series of parties through the decks down to the level where the magazine was, and then maybe a sort of a bucket brigade style arrangement down on that deck as well. But one of the key lessons that everybody in the Age of Sail knew was that you didn't want to have gunpowder outside of the magazines in any circumstance whatsoever unless it was directly in transit to a gun that was going to use it very quickly, because everyone knew how dangerous gunpowder was. Sergeant Schultz asks, I was watching QI and they discuss a trial or competition conducted by the Royal Navy in 1845 comparing screw versus paddle propulsion using the vessels HMS Rattler and HMS Alecto in a tug-of-war style, in order to determine which form was superior. Screw propulsion apparently won with no contest. Did this happen as described, and if so, what was the context or impetus for this test, and what, if any, accounts available are there of the test, and how were the results interpreted by the Navy? There are a number of accounts of the test from approximately the period. So there's accounts in the Mechanics magazine, but there's which is directly contemporary with the test in the 1840s, but in the early 1850s, there's a whole document which is mostly about the screw propeller generally, with suggestions on how to improve it, but it also contains a very detailed contemporary account of the tests between Rattler and Alecto. And as always, there is a little bit more to the story than just a tug of war. For one thing, the Royal Navy was already pretty sure the screw propeller was better. And the purpose of the tug of war was more of a decisive demonstration to the general public to justify things, especially for things like politicians. What's perhaps not always appreciated is that Rattler and Alecto was sister ships, or near enough sister ships. They're actually part of the same class, but Rattler had been finished with a slightly modified design with a screw. And before the tests began, they'd actually done a series of tests on Rattler using different types of screw to find the best one. And obviously she went into the test with this. But the tug of war was not the first test that occurred between a Rattler and Alecto. There was a whole series of tests that the Admiralty had done, which were designed to compare their performance in different circumstances. The first test was a race from the Nore to Yarmouth under steam power alone, and Rattler won that with a speed advantage of about 0.4 of a knot, which meant that by the time she got to Yarmouth Road, she was about 20 minutes ahead of Alecto. Then there was a 34-mile run under sail and steam from Yarmouth, which Rattler again won with a speed advantage of 0.7 of a knot, 11.9 knots for Rattler, 11.2 for Alecto. Then there was a race against heavy seas, which Rattler again won with a half-knot speed advantage, 7.5 knots versus 7, although it's noted that the actual speed of the two ships varied wildly during the test, what with pitching, some problems with the Rattler's boilers and so forth. Then there was a sail-only run, which meant that Alecto had to bring in her paddle boards, Rattler had to set her screw to vertical. Rattler won that as well, although by only the narrowest of margins. Then there was another sailing trial, which was a tacking trial, the other one having just been to run before the wind. Then another sail-only trial with the wind abeam. Rattler won both of those as well, although again by fairly narrow margins. Then there were 2 more trials where one ship would tow the other, whilst the other one would have no power going at all. So first, Rattler towed Alecto, with Alecto having no power, and then Alecto towed Rattler whilst Rattler had no power, and it turned out that Rattler could tow Alecto at 7 knots, whilst Alecto could only tow Rattler at 6. And it was only on the 9th trial that we have the famous tug of war, where after getting its engine started up, Rattler was able to pull Alecto backwards at about 2.5 knots. Then there were actually 3 more trials which used the 2 ships running, but with Rattler, which had slightly more powerful boilers to start with, running on reduced power, and Rattler generally came off the better in those as well. And as far as the Navy was concerned, this confirmed what they'd pretty much already concluded, which was that screws were better as forms of propulsion for most circumstances, but what it also gave them was a more quantifiable set of data of exactly how much better they were on similar ships. Sergeant Schultz asks, could you please offer historical context on the American invasion of Bougainville and Empress Augusta Bay in early November 1943? Specifically, my family has a connection to this battle as my grandpa's youngest brother was a 40mm bow gunner on USS Birmingham. I do know in the evening of November 8th he was torpedoed, blown into the water and subsequently picked up by a destroyer, injured, then transferred to the East Coast to recover and ended up with a metal plate in his head for the rest of his life. It was only very late in his life and at the persistence of my uncle that he shared what had happened to him. So Bougainville is part of the Solomon Islands chain. It's basically the biggest island in the northern section, but the US, obviously having conducted the Guadalcanal campaign further south earlier in the war, wasn't entirely obsessed with having every single possible island fully under its control. They recognized that occupying a bunch of mostly empty tropical islands was not really a good use of their manpower. However, further to the north was the major Japanese naval base of Rabaul, and they did want to get rid of that. The airfields that they'd captured in Henderson Field at Guadalcanal and other airfields further up the Solomon Island chain meant that big bombers, B-17s and so forth, could easily get to Rabaul, and even some of the longer-range medium bombers. But what couldn't get to Rabaul, at the time at least, were fighters and lighter bombers, which are obviously present in greater numbers as well, and the fighters are useful for escort against Japanese aircraft. So they needed a runway that was somewhat closer to Rabaul than what they had at the moment, which meant that the objective was to capture enough of Bougainville that they could set up some nice airfields for these lighter craft, and also there'd be good recovery airfields for damaged large bombers. And so an invasion was launched in early October and the beginning of November 1943. Empress Augusta Bay is about halfway up one side of Bougainville, so it was nominated as a good place to land. Now, whilst you had the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay, which occurred a few days earlier than the 8th of November, and that had seen off the initial Japanese attempt at naval response, with the specific incident that your grandfather's youngest brother was injured in, that occurred when, having cleared out the Japanese, the US moved in transports to unload men and supplies in Empress Augusta Bay. Birmingham, along with a number of other cruisers and destroyers, was part of the escort force, and without any direct naval contest, they then went on patrol in Empress Augusta Bay to keep the convoy safe from potential intruders and aircraft. And in the evening of the 8th of November, once the transports had spent most of the day offloading, Birmingham and the 1 or 2 ships that were with her came under sustained attack by Japanese bombers. And she took several hits from dive bombers, from Val's, but she also took a hit up in the bow from a torpedo, which is presumably the incident that you mentioned your relative was injured in. That blew a fairly big hole in her bow. Over 36 men were injured in the overall attack, and a few were also killed. The ship did manage to stay in formation despite relatively extensive upper works damage and, of course, the big hole in her bow, but she, of course, then needed to be sent back home for repairs shortly thereafter, which she did, and presumably that's where the transfer took place as well. Birmingham did, however, manage to shoot down quite a number of her attackers. It's just there were a lot of them, and a number of them released their weapons before they were shot down. John McCarthy asks, now that you've completed the videos on the ships that you visited during your 2022 US tour, do you have any general observations or opinions? In particular, some museum ships are in much better condition than others, and what do you think are the causes? Weather is one obvious factor, funding's another, and can you share any information about the relative amount of funding of the ships that you saw? I'm not sure if I can share specific information about relative funding for various ships, because I'm relatively sure that's sensitive data that they'd rather maybe not be in the public domain, certainly for some vessels. I mean, obviously, if they choose to share it on their own channels, that's their business, but I think that's a bit of a minefield for me to be talking about, especially considering that me visiting at the beginning of 2022, we were still very much in the immediate post-COVID world, so the amount of funding from various sources, including visitors, that ships were getting at that point would be very atypical compared to pre-COVID or even 2023 levels. But in general, in respect to funding, it is an ongoing issue for ships, and it is obviously something of a problem because some ships just simply have better locations than others. The one ship you probably never have to worry about running out of money is going to be USS Midway because, well, it's down in San Diego, right there on the riverfront. It has literal boatloads of tourists coming in and day out. So if even a fraction of them visit the ship, job done. Whereas other ships, some ships do have pretty nice, fairly visible locations, which make attracting visitors quite easy. USS Alabama's right next to an interstate, for example, and has its own little park to play in. Whereas others, like let's say USS Iowa or USS New Jersey, they do have some complications because Iowa is docked up basically in the LA commercial port area rather than in the sort of the leisure area of LA, and the neighborhood that it's docked up right next to is not necessarily always the safest. And likewise, USS New Jersey is docked up next to Camden, which it has a reputation in some parts, let's just say. And then you get, as you go further north, of course, weather issues become more and more of a problem. Now, that's not to say you don't have weather issues further south, North Carolina, Alabama, etc. They do get hurricanes and so forth, and perhaps the occasional visit by tornadoes. Texas as well, where she was. But those issues, to a certain extent, not entirely, but to a certain extent, are a little less serious because they tend to be one and done events. You don't have hurricanes every week for 6 months, and ships are designed to deal with high winds and rough seas. So there may be some superficial damage if you don't tie down the scout aircraft or something, but it is a known thing that you generally can deal with. Your biggest problem is perhaps the ship itself being blown and shifted around, but ships being in their own cofferdams and stuff can help mitigate that as well. As I say, not to downplay the threat of that kind of weather, but once you move past the sort of the middle section of the US where you get ships like the New Jersey, and then you get up north to where you get ships like Massachusetts and Salem are at home, now they have quite serious problems because it can get still quite warm in the summer, but it can get very, very cold in the winter and everything in between. So you've got huge temperature shifts, which aren't good for paintwork, they're not good for maintenance, and also not good for visitors. Because very few people are going to show up when it's, -10 and there's snow and ice everywhere for several months of the year. Whereas if you're further south where the weather is a bit more amenable, you can be open more days of the year and receive more visitors. And then, of course, as I said, ice has its own physical damage characteristics and so forth as well. So when you factor all that in, some ships are going to have higher maintenance bills because of the environment than others, and generally also if on average a maintenance bill is higher because of the environment, that usually means there is a hostile environment, like we just mentioned, which means you potentially also have fewer days where you can get visitors. So it's a very nasty double-edged sword there. And then, of course, you've got to contend with the fact on a state-by-state basis, various state governments may or may not give you much, if any, money. Some states are a lot more generous than others. And then, of course, you've also got the number of people who volunteer on a ship, because if you have, let's say, a dozen volunteers, they can do a certain amount. If you have 6 dozen volunteers, they can do a lot more. And, what state did you receive the ship in, either from the Navy or from the previous administrators? Because in some cases, ships have gone through multiple hands, not just in terms of curators, but in terms of actual administrative organizations since they became museum ships. That's not necessarily true of all of them, but certainly for some of them. And this is just covering the ones I've visited, let alone a lot of the ones that I haven't had a chance to go and see. But outside of the funding issues, and to wrap this one up a little bit, I think one of my general observations, now this is not necessarily true across the board when it comes to the UK, which I'm going to compare it to because it's the other country that I've seen the most museum ships in, but as a general trend, is that as far as I can tell, the staff on US museum ships tend to be a little more, I would say, a little more devoted to the ship. Now, some of that is because some of those ships were in service in one way, shape, or form for a lot longer than most of the UK's museum ships. So there are either still surviving crew or immediate first-generation descendants of surviving crew who are still taking a close interest in the ship. Whereas most of the UK's museum ships, with a few exceptions like Belfast, have been out of service for so long that there aren't any surviving crew or immediate descendants, so that kind of loosens the more personal hold on it. But also, I would say some, not all, British museum ships tend to be staffed by people who work more generically for an overall museum organization. And so it's just part of the job. Whereas the sense I got from a lot of volunteers on US museum ships is that they have volunteered specifically for that ship or because it is a ship. So they have a little bit more of a focused interest on naval history and the features of that vessel, or naval vessels in general. Now, as I said, that's not a broad brush slight on British museum ships. There are ships, like HMS Victory, where people are very dedicated to the ship, and there are individual staff that I've met on various museum ships who are also, again, very dedicated to their vessels. But as a more general trend, I think, at least my impression, is that the staff on US museum ships are a bit more attached to their ship, perhaps a little bit more so than the average UK museum ship staff, for which it is a job. But again, mileage varies on a person-to-person basis. But the other thing that I would say is that 98 to 99% of all the museum ship staff that I ran into, whether they be directors and curators or people manning the ticket booths at the front or the docents who show you around the ship or whatever, are generally incredibly friendly and helpful. And that really makes an experience. Now, that's not to say that there aren't friendly people aboard British museum ships. There definitely are. But yeah, there was just this sense that everybody wanted to be really nice and helpful, and not just to me visiting. I mean, half of the people aboard clearly had no idea who I was compared to anybody else, which actually was quite refreshing. But they was, therefore I could compare and contrast. The people who knew I was visiting and why I was there, you could, if you were being uncharitable, say, oh yes, well, Drac, it's in their interest to be nice and friendly to you. But then the people who were just like, oh, well, who's this guy? Oh, hello. And it's almost like you'd immediately made a new friend. Which, and I may have mentioned this in a Drydocks many, many years ago, but it does strike me as a bit of a contrast. I don't know if there's some kind of IQ test whereby the US Passport Office only issues the majority of passports to people with a particularly low social IQ or something. But having been to various countries around the world in my lifetime, as well as obviously being in the UK, prior to my various trips to the States, my opinion of the average American, particularly the average American tourist, was not especially high. Let's just say for you guys in the States, the people you export to other countries are generally, by far and away, not the best representatives of your country. So heading over to the States for my first big trip as an adult in April last year, I was a little bit nervous. I'd met some nice Americans overseas. Well, for them overseas in the UK and other places in the world. But I'm not sure, given the majority of them were not really that pleasant to be around, what's it going to be like in the States? And I was very pleasantly surprised that it was almost a reverse of things. Obviously, spending most of my time on the museum ship, so restricting my comments to that. But the staff and the people visiting on the museum ships generally are pretty nice people, people I'd look forward to going back to see again. So, I don't know, do you intentionally shove a bunch of particularly idiotic people out of the country, or do they get lost and find themselves in airports, or what? Or is there some kind of conspiracy that's going on to send the most loud and obnoxious people overseas as ambassadors through some very strange program that the US State Department's cooked up? I don't know, but whatever it is, I was very pleasantly surprised by the general attitude of the vast majority of people, staff and visitors that I met on the US ships. Paul Shen asks, why didn't the US Navy set up torpedo nets at Pearl Harbor? Was it the belief that the harbour depth was too shallow for airdrop torpedoes, or was there another reason? Even if they weren't worried about aerial torpedoes, they were clearly worried about submarine attack, as USS Ward's actions clearly demonstrated before the attack began. Yep, and for that exact reason, there was an anti-submarine net system complete with gates at the entrance to Pearl Harbor. This is just a couple of months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, so it gives you an idea of the overall layout. And the idea was simply, if the submarine can't get into Pearl Harbor in the first place, you don't need nets within the harbor. And as you mentioned, the harbor depth is quite shallow, so they weren't anticipating aerial torpedoes being able to be dropped, because everything that the US knew at that point said that they'd ground into the sand. Now, of course, the British had demonstrated it was possible to drop aerial torpedoes in shallow waters at Taranto, but that comes back over to the issue I've pointed out in a few other dry docks, where the Americans also tended generally to assume that the Japanese were just inferior, and therefore if this was a brand new British invention that they'd only recently used, well, obviously the Japanese were never going to pick that up in and of themselves in 6, 8, 12 months or however long. Yeah, well, that didn't work out for them very well, did it? But nonetheless, the other thing that you have to bear in mind when you look at this anchorage, you can see various ships anchored a bit closer here, and then Battleship Row there kind of centered on the left of Ford Island, is that you need anti-torpedo nets to be a little distance away from your ship, because if they catch the torpedo and it explodes, or the torpedo partly gets through and gets snagged at the back and then explodes, you want that explosion to be far enough away from your ship that it doesn't do a substantial amount of damage. Now, if you look at the positions of the battleships on Battleship Row and then factor in a series of anti-torpedo nets from this picture going off to the left, you realize that having those torpedo nets out would actually substantially reduce the width of the passage alongside that side of Ford Island. And then if you factor in where all the other ships are anchored, and if they've all got anti-torpedo nets, or you've got a larger system of anti-torpedo nets, all of a sudden you've made what's already a relatively congested anchorage an extremely congested anchorage, and the chances for something to go wrong, like a passing ship fouling its propellers on the net and chewing it up and disabling itself, become much, much higher. So it was seen as just not worth doing, essentially, because Why make your harbour really, really complex and dangerous for a threat you don't actually believe exists and you think you've managed with the anti-subnets further out? Although I must say, having now been to Pearl Harbor and knowing where all of these things are in relation to each other, it's very weird looking at this picture. You know, there's little patches of habitation, and then I'm looking at sort of, you know, the big pale patch off to the left, which is roughly the position of the US Pacific Fleet Submarine Museum. There's a road bridge to Fort Highland now. It's a little odd looking at it like this. Anton Alert asks, in regards to USS Ranger, is there anything that could have been done during the war to make her a viable combatant in the Pacific theatre? What if she was heavily damaged during Operation Torch and needed an extensive repair and or rebuild? What modifications would make her just a better ship overall? So one minor issue with Ranger was her speed. She was slower than Lexington, Saratoga, the Yorktowns and the Essexes, albeit she was approximately the same ballpark speed as Wasp, and, well, they sent Wasp out, so the speed is a little bit of an issue. She's just under 30 knots, but not a massive one, considering that most of her escorts, in terms of the heavy escorts, the battleships, are 27, 28 knotter ships. So, you know, it could be managed. The two much larger problems, well, there's a whole list of them, but two of the big ones. One, Ranger was never designed to operate torpedo bombers. She was just designed to operate fighters and dive bombers. And for a good chunk of the war in the Pacific, it was held that you did need torpedo bombers in some number. So eventually, I suppose if she had been badly damaged, she could have been repaired with the capability of storing the munitions for and operating torpedo bombers. She did eventually operate some torpedo bombers later in her career anyway, so it is possible, but it would have been expensive. The other much larger problem is armour, or more specifically, the lack of armour. She's not the world's most heavily protected ship along the sides, as you can see by the number of scuttles. Now, for an aircraft carrier, that's not hugely important, but as the US Navy had discovered through reports and experience, that splinter and blast damage was a big problem along the waterline of ships, which is one of the reasons why the Fletchers had essentially splinter-proof plating down a lot of their length. And, well, yeah, Ranger would have been considerably vulnerable to near misses. And on top of that, whilst the armour on the hangar deck of the Yorktowns was not great, it was better in the Essexes. At least still on the Yorktowns, whilst not great, it existed. In terms of horizontal protection for Ranger, you're looking at the steering compartment, and that's really about it. Which would mean that even a relatively demure 500-pound general purpose bomb from a Japanese dive bomber could potentially end up very deep in the ship and cause an awful lot of problems. So the only way you're really going to make Ranger, at least in the US Navy's mind, combat fit for Pacific operations is at least to probably stick a bunch of 1-inch splinter plating down her waterline, possible, and then at least do an inch of armour plate all across her hangar deck, so she at least matches at that point, the remaining Yorktown USS Enterprise in terms of protection there. That's going to add a lot of weight. That could cause potential issues with her stability and overall draft. You might compensate for that by some rather extensive refits. If she's really badly damaged, maybe rip out all the machinery and replace it with new stuff. You might buy back some of the lost weight, but you might also end up having to sacrifice some of your munitions, fighter fuel, or aircraft fuel and aircraft, and reduce her overall capacity as well. Because in the state that she's in, if she gets hit, she's in trouble. And potentially even more trouble than Wasp got into, and we know what happened to Wasp. There's a reason why Ranger was basically put in situations in the Atlantic where it was relatively unlikely she'd meet a serious concerted enemy air assault. That's one of the reasons, amongst many, she wasn't present in any of the Malta convoys, for instance. Glenn Ricafrente asks, could you describe in greater detail how Lieutenant Commander Bruce McCandless took command of the flagship USS San Francisco in the First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal after the senior officers, including Admiral Callaghan, were wiped out. Did he, a relatively junior officer, really in effect take command of the fleet by leading the other ships in the attack and sending signals as if he were an admiral? And were there any other cases in naval history where a junior officer took command of a fleet while his senior officers were out of action or communication? So, whilst Lieutenant Commander at the time, Bruce McCandless, did take command of the San Francisco, he did not take command of the fleet. This is for two reasons. Firstly, he wasn't even the most senior officer left on the ship. That was actually another lieutenant commander, but that lieutenant commander was also the damage control officer, and rather sensibly, having picked themselves up from the wreckage of the bridge, they looked around and went, well, at least McCandless, once the damage control officer came up, they looked around and went, yeah, maybe the guy who's in charge of damage control is probably going to be very, very needed and very busy doing damage control for the next few hours. So he then decided, right, I'm off to do my job. McCandless, guess you're in charge as the next most senior surviving officer. But yeah, it's in terms of how, apart from the actual official decision that he is in charge, the actual sort of point at which he actually gets to notice what's happened to the bridge. Obviously, the bridge takes a hit. Almost everybody on the bridge is killed. And then for McCandless, it's a case of, right, you know, almost like the Disney movie about Atlantis. It's like, who's not dead? Sound off. And it's like, well, it's just me. Oh, dear. So he had to take the con, which was then knocked out. Then he had to take the secondary con, which was then knocked out. Then he had to take command from the gunning tower, and then that was knocked out. So yeah, the Japanese were almost playing whack-a-mole with command positions on the San Francisco in the aftermath of her being heavily mauled in the first place. But the reason he didn't take command of the fleet was, you know, basically because San Francisco was physically incapable of commanding anything at that point. Pretty much all her communication systems had been knocked out and she'd been shot to pieces. She had no idea what was going on around her anyway, apart from occasionally Japanese ships popping up out of the murk. So there was nothing really for McCandless to tell the rest of the fleet, even if he could say anything to them, and he couldn't. Bearing in mind that, you know, in the aftermath of the battle, San Francisco was very nearly sunk by her own side, save for the fact that somebody managed to rig up a signal lamp out of a torch, because the actual signal lamps had all been destroyed, as had all the radios, as had pretty much every other means that the ship had of communication. So McCandless's job was essentially just to try and keep the ship going in vaguely a direction, and not run it into another batch of Japanese ships for as long as they needed to stabilize the vessel and make sure it wasn't lost. Now, in terms of other cases where junior officers taken in a command of the fleet when the senior officers are out of action or communication, it has very, very rarely happened on a very, very temporary basis. But in the era where intra-fleet communication was actually advanced enough for it to even matter, generally speaking, they would take command just long enough to let the fleet know that, you know, the admiral, the captain, and everyone senior over here is dead, because there would be other designated senior officers in other ships who would then take over leadership of the fleet. So, for example, when Nelson was killed aboard HMS Victory at the Battle of Trafalgar, that didn't mean that Captain Hardy was now in charge of the fleet. Once it became even relevant to tell anyone, it fell to Admiral Collingwood on Royal Sovereign to take command of the fleet. And similarly, you know, if in pretty much all large-scale naval engagements, there are multiple officers of flag rank present, and if one of them has been killed, the senior one, then the job of whoever is left aboard that particular ship is to let the rest of the fleet know, so that the next most senior flag officer on another ship can take over. The slight problem, of course, at Guadalcanal was that not only had Callaghan been killed, but Callaghan and San Francisco had almost certainly killed Admiral Scott, who would have been the one to take over some minutes earlier, which rather complicated things. Plus, as I said, by that stage of the battle, the situational awareness of anybody was pretty much shot. It was just a case of, try and keep yourself alive and try and spot the enemy and shoot them before they shoot you, and just pray and hope that you're good at enemy ID and you haven't accidentally shot up one of your own ships. Roadrunner Meep Meep asks, we all know about British ships that overperformed compared to their design top speed, but which ships from any navy do the worst compared to their design top speed? The single worst offenders, at least in a period where speed trials were run, is probably the Imperial German Navy of World War I. And I've covered this in a few previous dry docks, but the short version is that during the pre-World War I period, when these ships were being built, the constructors, as was the case with several other nations, would have incentives, i.e., we want, let's say, a battle cruiser that does 26 knots. But for every half knot, or quarter knot, or whatever measure they decide to use on that particular occasion, you go faster than that, you get a financial reward. So obviously the shipbuilders are incentivized to make the ships as fast as humanly possible. But how do you do that when the design of the ship you're building might mitigate against you actually reaching much faster than the design top speed? Well, the answer is you get a specialist engineering crew, the best stokers in the fleet, the best engineers. You make sure you buy the most expensive, highest quality anthracite coal, import it from overseas if you have to, or potentially Shanghai a little bit from the sources of anthracite coal that Germany did actually have access to, but prioritized for other purposes usually. And then you take it out on a measured run in an area of sea where this depth of the sea is conducive to give you just a little bit of an extra boost as well. And combine all of those things together, and don't sail into a strong wind, and make sure the currents and the tides are right, and all of a sudden you end up with a trial speed of 28 knots. So you make a big fortune in bonuses. And then you get a bunch of people post-war, like nowadays on the internet, who are like, well, actually, Drac, in certain trials, the German battlecruiser proved capable of 28 or 29 or 30 knots, so clearly they were far superior to everybody else's. It's like, yes, and when did they ever repeat that speed in actual, service or combat conditions? Answer, never. Partly because, well, not to knock the German engineering crews, but the average engineering crew in a fleet is obviously not going to be quite as good as the best one in the fleet. That's why they're the best. The sea conditions, both in terms of winds, waves and tides and sea depth, are just whatever they are wherever you happen to be. So they're not your specialist area for your measured mile or whatever. And of course, you're stuck with the much more bituminous, nasty coal that the German fleet is generally issued with, and so in actual combat service, plus of course you're loaded down with all your war stores, you actually tended to find that Imperial German ships routinely tended to perform slightly under their trial speeds in most circumstances that weren't absolutely dire. And I mean, you see this just, in practical experience. If the German battle cruisers were actually all capable of 28 knots, the way that some of their trials suggested they were, then the Battle of Dogger Bank would never have happened. Sure, Blucher would still have been overhauled and destroyed, but the rest of the German ships would have been long gone before Beatty ever stood a chance of catching up. And in fact, Beatty would never have actually caught up or have been closing with them, because the vast majority of Beatty's fleet was not capable of 28 knots or more. Well, even if they were capable of 28 knots, some of the later ones were. They'd need to be 29, 30 knot ships to close down on the German battle cruisers, and they weren't. Yet still they managed to close them down, so there you go. A second place would probably be taken by Italian World War II capital ships, both the Littorios and the refits of the older ships. And, well, if you think the German way of dealing with trials is a little bit of a cheat, Just wait till you see some of the pictures of some of the Italian ships on trials. Now, granted, there are pictures where the Italian ships look pretty much complete and they're executing sea trials, but there are also pictures of both the Littorio class and the older Duilio and Cavours going out on their specifically speed trials, and you'll notice substantial parts of the ship are missing, like half the superstructure and the main armament. Suspiciously, these ships were capable of going phenomenally faster once you didn't have several hundred to several thousand tons of upper works and weaponry aboard, and then mysteriously they became a lot slower in active service once those things were aboard. So yeah, cheating on your speed trials is good at getting the manufacturers or shipyards extra money. It's not so great in real life. Joao Rita asks, I've repeatedly heard that damage to a funnel, specifically it getting holed, can cause a ship to slow down, but I don't understand why. Short of the funnel collapsing and blocking the exhaust, why do the extra holes cause the ship to slow down? It's thermodynamics, essentially. A bit of physics in two separate ways. Essentially, the height from the boiler to the top of the funnel, and bearing in mind that includes the trunking through the ship, forms a specific height, which is the draft of the funnel. And if you've ever worked with anything to do with chimneys, whether that be chimneys in houses or chimneys in factory settings, you'll see where this is going. Basically, generally speaking, the higher the draft, the more air gets pulled through, because obviously hot air rises, and as you have a nice tall chimney, that hot air will rise towards the much cooler and lower pressure air high up at the top, and the bigger that reach, the more that air will accelerate, and thus the more air is being pulled through the boiler room, which means the more air there is to the boilers, which means more oxygen to the boilers, which means that it burns fuel more efficiently, which means you get more power. If you suddenly have this exhaust venting considerably lower down on the funnel, then the height of the draft is less, and therefore the speed at which the air is effectively being sucked out once the funnel's working properly is reduced, and therefore the amount of air that can come into the boilers is reduced, therefore power is decreased and you slow down. The other aspect of it is that, as you can see with this hole in the funnel of HMS Sydney, if someone punches a hole in the side of your funnel, you generally have big flanges of metal in the airflow, which also slows down and disrupts the airflow, which is going to further decrease the amount of air that's able to come out of the funnel, and therefore you're going to end up with less air and therefore less oxygen in the boilers, which again, lower power output, and thus you slow down. It's basically like, if on land you have a chimney, if the chimney falls over or partially collapses, the efficiency of whatever furnaces you've got underneath goes down, and indeed you can get back blow, which is not good in any way, shape or form. It's one of the many reasons when you see things like little portable bread ovens as well, or firing kilns, etc. They all tend to have funnels, chimneys, whatever you want to call them, to allow the hot air to rise, and once it starts rising out there and displacing into the open air, it creates a draw which sucks more air through, which improves the combustion, which increases the temperature. Whereas if you have, say, a portable bread oven and you just cap that so the air is just venting out the same way it comes in, then obviously the fire gets very, very smoky and the temperature drops dramatically. And similarly, when you see, again, these more traditional clay bread ovens, that funnel is not just an opening at the top, it's an actual chimney. If you cut that chimney off, again, the whole thing tends to die down a bit. Rodney McCoy asks, after listening to John Parshall talk about the Japanese carriers Hio and Junyo, it got me wondering, would USS Ranger have performed any better or worse than these two dubious carriers for the Japanese Navy, especially in the desperate hours of late 42 and early 43? Well, since she's a surface vessel, we can look at the basic speed protection and firepower triangle to get a basic idea of what would happen. Now, protection-wise, neither Hio and Junyo nor Ranger have any particularly great protection to write home about. Hio and Junyo were tested in as much as they were hit repeatedly and proved somewhat tough when they took torpedo hits, but we don't know how tough Ranger would have been being hit by torpedoes because she wasn't. So that's kind of a wash. Speed, Ranger is 4 to 5 knots faster than Hio and Junyo, so that would have been of some use. It would have allowed the Japanese to operate slightly faster, keep up with other carrier formations. I mean, the Ranger would have been a knot to a knot and a half faster than Kaga, for example, so Hio and Junyo could potentially... so a Ranger in place of Hio and Junyo could have potentially been part of the WWII formerly. And in terms of, well, loosely firepower, Ranger can carry significantly more aircraft than Hio and Junyo. Now, of course, if the Japanese are operating Japanese aircraft and storing them in the way that the Japanese Navy prefers, then that number may fall, but theoretically, you can put more aircraft on Ranger. So you would have, compared to Ranger replacing either Hio or Junyo, a slightly faster carrier, probably with broadly the same amount of protection, but with a larger strike group. Now, whether or not the Japanese can actually provide enough trained pilots and aircraft to man that strike group is another question entirely. But yes, on paper, Ranger would have been a better vessel to have than either Hio or Junyo, although the combined capabilities of the two Japanese carriers is probably better to have than a single, slightly better one. Michael Gilson asks, would it have made sense for the Kriegsmarine to have converted some Black Sea freighters into Hilfskreuzer, not as raiders, but to provide naval gunfire support for Case Blue? I don't really think so, because Hilfskreuzer are, well, they're disguised merchant ships to function as long-distance raiders. So their armament, although quite heavy for a merchant vessel, is necessarily limited to what you can hide, and certain types of ships that are optimized to Hilfskreuzer mission would not necessarily be ideal for operations in the Black Sea. Now, the idea of perhaps having some kind of impromptu offshore fire support vessel put together might have a degree of validity, but I don't think in terms of the classic Hilfskreuzer ideal. The other thing you've got to remember when it comes to Case Blue, assuming that I'm reading the maps correctly, is that a lot of the Case Blue coastal operations were taking place on the Sea of Azov, and if you've seen the Black Sea element of the Crimean War video that I did, then you'll know the Sea of Azov is actually quite shallow, so very large oceanic freighters would struggle quite a lot to operate in the Sea of Azov, which is obviously not brilliant. But then I suppose if they're Black Sea freighters, there might be some Black Sea freighters with shallow drafts. So rather than a Hilfskreuzer, I would say maybe taking some relatively shallow draft freighters with large open decks and just covering them in old naval guns or even field artillery as a kind of chop shop monitor or landing craft gun, that might be viable, but you'd first have to get them into the Sea of Azov, and initially the Kerch Strait, hey, it's relevant again, would have to be transited by the ships whilst it's under Soviet control, or you'd have to wait until the final stages of the offensive are underway, or you end up just using them off of Sevastopol and much later in the campaign. And so I reckon there's probably a degree of utility in it, but not a huge amount, and compared to the investment of resources and the potential loss of the vessels, because bearing in mind the Soviet Black Sea Fleet was still to a certain degree operational, and whilst vessels like the Tashkent aren't going to stop the German advance cold, a fast destroyer like Tashkent could quite easily rip apart any number of impromptu fire support ships made out of freighters. So it'll be a fairly high-risk, low-reward scenario, but maybe something that in the latter stages they might have put together just because. The Wind Thief asks, both with and without hindsight, how would you have designed the US standards had you been in charge? Without hindsight, there's relatively few changes I would have made as a period designer. I think the main thing if any other change I was going to make went by the wayside, the main thing I would change would be the cage masts, because they were not implemented in the best way. They weren't that brilliant compared to what they were promised to be. They would have been better with just regular tripod masts. So if it was up to me, I either would have just looked at the outcomes of the initial trials with the cage masts on, the South Carolinas and the various pre-dreadnoughts that have been refitted with them, and just gone, no, we're going back to tripods. It's just that simple. Other than that, maybe the movement of the secondary battery up a level and out of casemates being done sooner. I think those would be the only ones which you could realistically say at the time might have been changed, and they both were a matter of discussion, to be honest. With hindsight, however, there are quite a few things that I would change. So, for example, I'd change the spacing on the main battery guns to avoid the interference which plagued the ships, which caused inaccuracy in the early parts of their career, especially for the earlier to mid standards. I would also press for the adoption of the triple turret just a little bit sooner. So with the Nevadas, you could have either 3 triples or 4 triples rather than 2 triples and 2 twins, because 4 triples will give you more firepower for a very marginal increase in length, and 3 triples means that you dramatically decrease the overall citadel length whilst only sacrificing a single gun. Now, in regards to citadel length, that's another thing I would change. So the US, around about this time, developed an obsession with having the armoured length of the ship being a fixed percentage, or near enough fixed percentage, of the ship's total hull length, around about somewhere in the 70s of percents of the total length. Now, that restricted them from being able to utilise some of the more elegant design solutions, like shortening the citadel, because you can't shorten it beyond a certain amount, according to the design principles, and also it meant that the weight of vessels that were longer went up quite catastrophically, because you could have, like you see here in New Mexico class, and you could go, okay, but what if we make the hull 50 foot longer? Because if we make the hull 50 foot longer, we're not adding any additional weapons or anything else like that, but basic principle of ship design, a 50 foot longer hull with exactly the same power plant, etc., will go faster, and there'll be a relatively minimal increase in weight. But that only applies if you keep the citadel the same length, whereas if you have this fixed percentage rule, you go, oh, well, if we make the hull 50 foot longer, then that means we've got to add another 35 foot of armour, and now the weight's gone up quite a bit, and now you have to think about upgrading machinery, and etc. So by abandoning that rule, I think it would be possible to finesse the designs to get a little bit more speed out of them. And if you've got a slightly freer hand with the citadel size, you might also be able to fit in a little bit more powerful machinery. I mean, the standards are pretty much all running on oil, at which point you could turn around and say, okay, well, we're going to make our standard battle line speed, let's say 23 knots, which is about what the Revengers were capable of once they'd switched over in mid-design process to their entire oil-fired propulsion systems. Now, okay, it's quote-unquote only an increase in speed of 2 knots, to 23 knots. But if you can get a 23-knot battle line, that means you actually have, if you're just using the standards, the fastest battle line. And it also leaves you a lot more scope for interwar upgrades. Now, I'm not necessarily saying you should do an Italian-style upgrade of all the standards, but refitting them with newer machinery, if you wanted to, later in the 1930s, if you've got a baseline speed of 23 knots, there's going to be a lot more temptation to maybe push them up 2 or 3 knots with brand new machinery, whilst also doing all the other upgrades. And in an ideal world, switch over to the 16-inch gun a lot sooner, but that's what the US Navy wanted to do originally. They just were told no by the Secretary of the Navy. King Brock asks, besides Hood and Bismarck, what are other examples of golden BBs in naval history? In terms of a single action that had a massively decisive swing impact on the ship's fate or on the battle the ship was in, There's quite a few, although they tend to be mixed in with a lot of other hits as compared to Hood or Bismarck, which at the time of their respective Golden BBs, obviously the Hood being blown up and Bismarck getting a hit to the rudder, they'd both received relatively few hits up to that point. But various examples, SMS Lutzow, as you can see here, if Invincible hadn't plugged that 12-inch shell into her torpedo flat, she probably would have done a Seydlitz and limped home, but that one hit the torpedo flat, and that was pretty much it. Once that had flooded, her fate was almost inevitable. You could potentially argue Scharnhorst, because despite the near-perfect ambush that Duke of York pulled off, Scharnhorst almost was on the point of maybe getting away, or at least having to be brought to bay by destroyers and cruisers again in a much longer engagement, when almost certainly one of Duke of York's shells popped a bunch of her power plant, so she slowed down, and then that was pretty much it. The fight between Serapis and Bonhomme Richard, John Paul Jones' famous action, if that one guy up in the masts hadn't happened to drop a grenade in such a way that it just so happened to set off a bunch of gunpowder on Serapis, then the foundational legends of the US Navy would probably be quite different, because at that point, Bonhomme Richard almost certainly would have just been sunk, with most hands going down with her, by Serapis. You could maybe make an argument for the hit that took out the fuel distillation and fractioning plant on Graf Spee, because almost everything else, she could have made a break for it. Obviously, she, believing that Renown and Ark Royal were offshore, she wasn't going to. But in purely material terms, let's say the deception was realised, the destruction of almost everything else aboard Graf Spee that had happened in the Battle of the River Plate could be coped with by seizing materials, whether they be fresh water or supplies or anything else, from merchant ships you might encounter on her way elsewhere, or buying them from other neutral ports. But with her ability to produce and refine new proper diesel fuel for her engines crippled, she wasn't going anywhere, and her fate at that point was pretty much set. In a similar manner to Bismarck, you could argue perhaps the torpedo hit to the Italian cruiser Pola that completely crippled her propulsion systems. A hit almost anywhere else on that ship, and she would have been able to limp away, but exactly where it hit meant that she was dead in the water, and that then contributed to the chain of events that led to a good chunk of the Zara class getting wiped out at the Battle of Cape Matapan. The Judge 2017 asks, Zuikaku in her final battle was painted in green camouflage. It seems like a poor idea to send her out in a blue ocean. Why was she wearing this green camouflage? Did the Japanese not have blue paint? Well, there's two parts to this. Firstly, the Japanese did look at several points as to whether it was even worth camouflaging their aircraft carriers at all, and generally the conclusion came back no, because an aircraft carrier is so recognisably an aircraft carrier that practically any attempt to camouflage it as anything different is probably just pointless. But towards the end of the war, when losing aircraft carriers was becoming something of a Japanese habit, they decided that, well, something is better than nothing. And so you actually have two different camouflage schemes going on when you get to the green Japanese carriers. On the sides, it's a simple silhouette. So it's a lighter green base with a darker green merchant ship silhouette painted on the side, at which point the idea is, well, if you're close enough that the coloration starts to matter, then realistically you're going to see it's an aircraft carrier and it doesn't matter. But at very long distances, especially in the heat haze that you normally get over the Pacific Ocean waters, the fact that the base colour is a light green, specifically a light olive green, is not so much relevant as the fact that it's a lighter colour is. So in the mist and the haze and so on and so forth, that light colour is much more likely to blend into the general background, whether that background be the sea, the sky, the mist, or nearby islands or whatever, compared to the much darker blob at the front. So, I mean, okay, doing it in bright orange would not help, but a pale green versus a pale blue versus a pale grey is much of a muchness in terms of the principle. So it's an anti-sub measure, although quite why you'd paint a carrier up as a merchant ship when the US submarines at that point were quite happy to go after merchant ships as well. Maybe underestimate the speed or something. But then you have on the upper decks, the flight deck specifically, camouflage which is meant to deceive aircraft, completely different from the camouflage on the side. And this takes basically three forms. There's the fact that it's a bit broken up, which is supposed to make it harder to determine what the ship is doing. Then you can see at the bow here of Suikaku, you've got this false bow painted on. And that is, as you can see, is actually offset. So it's designed to give ships, specifically dive bombers, a false idea of where the ship is actually going. And so maybe they'll drop their bombs and miss. And whilst obviously this is a black and white photo, you can actually see that, again, it's the contrast of colour that is actually having a certain degree of effect, regardless of the specifics of exactly what colour it is. That false bow there, if you just casually look at it or slightly defocus your eyes, you'll notice that the corners of the flight deck that are in the darker green actually do kind of blend in with the rest of the sea, albeit, as I said, this is a black and white photo. And then the last element of the painting on the flight decks was various shapes which were meant to give the vague impression that maybe the ship had some kind of gun turrets or superstructure and therefore was not a carrier. But again, this was kind of a little bit half-hearted because of the aforementioned Japanese conclusion that it wouldn't make any difference anyway. So essentially what it comes down to is what was more important in terms of the attempts at camouflage was the contrast between colours, which either draws the eye to or slides the eye away from them, rather than necessarily the specific colours. And I mean, you see this even with Allied ships, because you look at most Allied ships in the Pacific, they're grey with varying shades. You know, the dark blue paint camouflage scheme that the US Navy did have in the earlier part of the war was not as present in the latter part of the war. There were some pale blues still around, but very pale blue and various forms of naval grey were the predominant colours in the various Allied fleets. So even they weren't trying to paint their ships to blend in perfectly with the ocean. JEC asks, I'm about to take a week-long trip to some beaches in northern France, and in reading Stephen Ambrose's book on D-Day, he mentions that US battleships were unable to penetrate the hardened bunkers at locations such as Point du Hoc, with battleship caliber hits being visible that didn't penetrate. Was this an ammunition selection issue, where Texas and Nevada were using high-capacity shells when armour-piercing would have been more appropriate, or some sort of performance issue with the 14-inch guns, or something else? So there's a few layers to this. Firstly, it is to a certain extent possible to be deceived by some of the shell impact sites on the bunkers, because if you get hit by, let's say, an 8-inch shell from a heavy cruiser, if that hits and, let's say, it's base fused, so it maybe penetrates a little bit into the concrete and explodes, the divot it's going to blow out of that lump of concrete is going to be substantially larger than 8 inches, which means if you then measure it, it's going to look like a battleship shell hit. So you have to be careful of that. But it is the case that some battleship shells did hit bunkers and didn't penetrate. But there's a number of reasons for that. The first thing, as I said, is, of course, that the most hits on the bunkers were by much smaller caliber shells, because the battleships generally were engaging other targets. But where a shell did hit, it's not so much an ammunition selection problem, albeit that the reason that the battleship shells that hit didn't penetrate was because, yes, they were high capacity, or as we might colloquially call it, HE shells. That is the case, and of course an HE shell pretty much detonates on contact, which means that if you fire it at a bunker that's 5, 6, 10 foot thick, it's going to do a complete number on the people inside, similar to the conning tower principle. It's going to disorientate them, it's going to deafen them, it's going to cause all sorts of problems, but it's not going to penetrate. Although, as just mentioned, it would still be relatively effective. But to suggest that it was wrong for the battleships to use these shells instead of armor-piercing is in and of itself a little bit wrong. And the US Navy actually, obviously, by 1944, had a fair bit of experience with shore bombardment from various other operations in the Pacific and back in the European theatre. And in some of the earlier bombardments, not at D-Day but at other locations, they had tried to use armour-piercing shells, and the bombardments had been incredibly ineffective. And that's simply because a bunker is a very small target. The chances of you actually hitting are relatively low. And yes, if you did hit a bunker with an AP shell, it would go through and explode and probably destroy the bunker. But all the shells that don't hit something as substantial as a concrete bunker, which tend to just plough into the ground or into the beach, those things, sand, soil, etc., don't provide anywhere near enough resistance to actually set off the AP shell's fuse in a lot of cases, which means that if you're plastering an area with gunfire from a battleship, if you use AP shells, the 2 or 3 hits you score on a couple of bunkers, okay, they'll take out those bunkers, but all those other targets you were shooting at, tank formations, open artillery formations, less emplaced coastal batteries, troop concentrations, machine gun nests, snipers, as Texas did, etc., all of those are probably going to be completely unharmed. I mean, if you're the really, 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 really unlucky sniper who eats a 14-inch AP shell to the face, yeah, you're not getting up and walking away from that one, but you could have a 14-inch AP shell land 15 feet away from you, and aside from a spray of dirt and perhaps a little bit of roughing up from the shockwave of the shells passing, you'd probably be fine. Whereas if a 14-inch high explosive shell lands 15 feet away from you, they're going to be collecting what's left of you in a thimble. So given that a high explosive shell or HC shell impact on a bunker would still have a fairly deleterious effect on the bunker's contents, and it was a much, much more effective shell overall to use on everything else in the shore bombardment mission, it was just much better to use the HE or HC shell, depending on which navy you were in, rather than the AP, even if that meant that, technically speaking, yes, there were a few shells that hit bunkers that didn't penetrate them. DM Phoenix asks, I recently read an article talking about the infamous rubber flight deck of the carrier HMS Warrior as retrofitted in 1948, and was curious on what your thoughts are regarding it. It's such an absurd idea in retrospect, but the fact it was actually built and tested begs the question, could it have worked with more refinement, perhaps for drones in the modern day? Well, it's not a matter so much of could it have worked with more refinement. It worked. Once the initial testing issues are out the way, the testing period for the rubber flight deck was actually one of the least deadly, least dangerous and least damaging prototype test phases of any real major advance in carrier technology. The rubber flight deck was a pretty safe system as long as you had a pilot experienced enough to use it. But whilst the logic behind it was to a certain degree sound, namely that early jet aircraft had pitifully short ranges and endurance times, and you needed to save weight as much as humanly possible, and by eliminating the weight and volume taken up by landing gear, you could have more fuel and a more aerodynamic aircraft, which would then mean you could go further and for longer, which was all good. The larger problems with the rubber flight deck are not to do with the safety or the workability of actually taking off and landing from the thing. It's more to do with what you do once you've landed, and also more generally what your aircraft can do. Because if you have aircraft that are specialized to land on a rubber flight deck, i.e. they don't have any landing gear, that means they can only land on a rubber flight deck, which then means you either have to roll rubber flight decks out across your entire fleet and thus adopt purely no landing gear aircraft, or you have to absolutely hope that these aircraft only ever are going to recover to a very, very specific number of aircraft carriers and land bases when they're training. Neither of which is a particularly brilliant idea. And then once the aircraft comes to a stop, well, now you have to try and maneuver the thing. An aircraft with a conventional landing gear can either move under the power of its engines at low speed, or it can just be towed by vehicles on the aircraft carrier because, hey, it's already on wheels. Whereas this thing is stuck essentially to rubber, which, you know, unless you sluice lots of lubricant over it, is not particularly good at letting you drag things across it. And even if you could, it would probably be very inefficient and damage the flight deck. So you'd need a system of cranes, a system of detachable trolleys that you could pop the aircraft on for maneuvering around. It just makes the logistics of aircraft operation much more complex and much longer, even if the actual landing bit is quite cool. And those issues surrounding the problem really haven't changed. So even today, with drones, well, I mean, the other thing is, with modern aircraft, you have an additional problem, because you see, like with this Sea Vampire or Sea Venom, the underside is nice and smooth and the engines are integrated into the wings. Most modern aircraft tend to have weapons hardpoints, or sensors, or weapons bays, or pitot tubes, or, you know, antenna, all sorts of other weird and wonderful things poking out of the underside of the aircraft, which would either rip up the rubber flight deck or snag and cause the thing to flip and tumble out of control. So most modern aircraft, even drones, are not going to be in any way, shape or form suitable for this kind of landing anymore. And you would still have the problem of, well, what do you do once it's down? How do you move it around? And if it's light enough that that's not going to be a problem, well, then you could probably just land it conventionally. Or if it's got vertical takeoff and landing capability, like it's a quad or octocopter, well, again, you might as well just land that conventionally on a steel flight deck as well. Where it could be useful, though, would be perhaps outside of military context in terms of medical transport and supply drones. So there are a number of countries which have varying degrees of medical supply transportation drone networks, which they're basically small UAVs. They tend to get catapulted off and then caught in nets, or they airdrop the supplies down to people and then return home. And perhaps for those things, which are basically man-portable drones anyway, then maybe some form of rubberized or otherwise flexible landing platform might be beneficial for them, because they, with their lightweight, the maneuverability of them once they're landed isn't a problem. And as I said, they tend to be launched by catapult anyway, so landing gear is not really a thing that they particularly require. Jeffrey Connolly asks, I've heard the UK nearly sold the US Navy the battleship Duke of York. Had this been true, and actually happened, would the US Navy have been able to supply her the necessary ammunition for her guns? And by the war's end, how many 40mm and 20mm guns could fit on her following the Americans' famous and somewhat fanatical guns everywhere policy? Now, this is something that's cropped up once or twice before, the idea of Duke of York almost being sold to the US Navy. I've not seen where this comes from, so if anybody can enlighten me in the comments below what's the source of this, I'd like to dig into this further, because I've not seen any evidence of it myself in my reading, but, you know, there's always new stuff to be found. Now, in terms of her ammunition supply, well, the US already has and manufactures 14-inch shells, so, you know, that's entirely viable. The US 14-inch shells are somewhat shorter than the shells on Duke of York, so in theory the US shells could actually just fit straight into Duke of York's hoist, although they would need a sort of a padding or a spacer of some description. They probably wouldn't necessarily fly entirely right, but given that the US was able to be persuaded to manufacture a special batch of 15-inch shells for Richelieu, and that was a caliber they didn't even use, the idea of them manufacturing a slightly modified shell in a caliber they did already use, yeah, they could have easily done that. Now, in terms of the 5.25-inch ammo, Again, it would be possible to produce a small batch of 5.25 ammo, but if they're taking Duke of York in for a complete overhaul and refit to US stands, either putting US radar, communication systems, etc., and while they're waiting for whatever form of 14-inch shell to arrive, I personally suspect that with something like the 5.25s, the US might, and I stress might, have just lifted them off and stuck a set of 5-inch 38s in instead. Because again, the 5-inch 38 is a smaller, lighter gun and a smaller, lighter shell, which means you could easily sit 5-inch 38 mounts in instead of the 5.25s, which would make it a much easier vessel to operate alongside all the other US battleships and all the other ships that are operating 5-inch 38s instead. Now, in terms of how many Bofors and Oerlikons you can get on the ship, well, the King George V deck layout is somewhat different compared to a North Carolina or South Dakota, etc. And weirdly enough, in terms of gun barrels, the King George V generally carried slightly more 40mm barrels than US ships, because the British ships split their 40mm between the pom-poms and Bofors, but carried substantially fewer Oerlikons. Now, if you go by US practice, obviously they'll probably take the pom-poms off at the same time that, let's say, they're swapping the 5.25s for 5-inch 38s. Now, the other thing you've got to factor in is that the British carriers obviously have that big amidships area for aircraft handling, and the US battleships have their aircraft handling facilities aft. If you took out the aircraft handling facilities, you could possibly build a multi-tiered nest of 40mm and 20mm amidships, but unless you built quite a high pedestal for them, they're going to have relatively limited fire arcs. But you could build a relatively lightweight structure, perhaps over the aircraft catapult section, and then put a bunch of 40mm and 20mm on there. Other than that, 40mm and 20mm pretty much will probably go where the British put their own 40mm and 20mm equipment. The stern of the King George V design is a little bit finer than that of the North Carolinas, and the South Dakotas and Iowas as well, so you're maybe fit slightly fewer aft, but there is slightly more deck space forward, so you might fit a few more AA guns forward. So broadly speaking, I think they'd probably have about the same number of 40mm and 20mm barrels as let's say a North Carolina, which is its closest equivalent in terms of both size and design period. But, as I said, there is this possibility that you could get a nice gallery of 20mm going between the heavy AA amidships, and if you do build this kind of pedestal, multi-tiered pedestal over it and remove the aircraft facilities, then perhaps you might even end up with maybe 15-20% more barrels than you'd find on a typical South Dakota or North Carolina. The almighty Hypnotoad asks, of all the designs made by the Austro-Hungarian MTK, Marinetechnische Komitee, the Marine Technical Committee, which one, if built, would have been most suited to combat in late World War I or an early 1920s scenario? So I looked through the various designs that they prepared for battleships and battlecruisers, and yes, the Austro-Hungarian Navy was preparing designs for ships beyond the ersatz monarchs, a whole range of different battleship and battlecruiser proposals. But whilst a lot of them have some fairly interesting design ideas and they're generally pretty good on the firepower and the speed, for a late war period, i.e. late World War I, early 1920s design, the Austro-Hungarian designs are almost universally under-armoured. So the battle cruisers, admittedly, they've got 8 and a bit - 9 inches of armour, which is about the same as a Lion Class or Tiger or Renown once it's been refitted, but no one ever accused them of being particularly well protected, especially considering you have things like Hood and then in the 1920s G3 and Amagi coming around. So battle cruisers and the battleships never seem to really exceed 12 inches of belt armour, so I'm afraid whilst they're nice, they are a little bit glass cannon-y. Their cruisers have, again, some interesting design ideas, but nothing that particularly stands out as a very capable combat cruiser on the lines of a Hawkins or an Emden, or what the Germans wanted to build instead of Emden, or even an Omaha. So, rule out the cruisers as well. But when it comes to destroyers, they did have some very, very nice ideas. Destroyers ranging everything from 1,000 up to 2,000 tons with several design stages in between. And this particular example for a 2,000-ton destroyer, I think, would have been the best suited for late World War I, early 1920s scenario combat, and then to be developed and future-proofed later on. Now, part of it comes from the fact it's a 2,000-ton destroyer in the late 1910s, early 1920s, which means it's going to be substantially larger than pretty much anything else in that size category, which means it's going to dominate the competition, or should dominate the competition just because of that size. And as you can see, it has 6 twin torpedo launchers, all mounted aft of the last funnel, and it has 4 single 150mm guns. Now, granted, that is somewhat overgunned, even for a 2,000-ton destroyer, but I think if these ships had been built, it would have been very rapidly clear that this is somewhat impractical, and therefore they could have then swapped them for something a little bit more practical. And at the size and scale of this kind of ship, I mean, I'm not the world's greatest fan of the gun and torpedo layout either, to be perfectly honest, but I think I like this design because it has so much opportunity for future development. So, for example, this might have been the first draft they came up with, but if the Austro-Hungarian Empire had survived and on into the early 1920s and was in the process of trying to build these things, I'd like to think cooler heads would have prevailed and gone, well, hang on a minute, instead of having 3 twin launchers aft, how about we put 2 triple launchers where the 2 guns are either in between the funnels, so we've got the same number of torpedoes, but on only 2 launchers instead of 3. And then instead of having these 150mm guns, how about we take some 4-inch guns, let's say, or 4 or 4.7 or 4 point something inch, 4.1 inch maybe, that's a caliber that the Austro-Hungarian and German navies liked. And instead of having singles, because of the dramatically lessened weight, we can have twins. So we could have, let's say, a twin 4.1 inch up front, and maybe not a twin right where that last 150 is aft, but if you've moved all of the torpedo launchers, as I suggested, you could maybe have a pair of twin 4.1 inch, maybe one where on this design sketch at the moment the aftmost torpedo launcher is, and then where you've got that little hurricane deck that's above the middle of the twin torpedo launchers, you can extend the platform that's aft there, relocate your anti-aircraft guns a little bit, and have a super firing twin 4.1 inch. So you've got a 6 gun, 6 torpedo tube, 2,000-ton fast destroyer with plenty of opportunity for upgrades, because you've still got that space between the mainmast and the aft funnel to put something in the future. So yeah, in terms of future-proofing, I think this is probably the best design that they came up with. Andrew Waite asks, which of the 3 unfinished Admiral Class battlecruisers, Anson, Howe and Rodney, was most complete when cancelled, and how many pictures of these ships under construction are there? I believe it was HMS Rodney that was the most complete when they were cancelled, albeit I think I'm about 85% confident in that. So if anyone has different information, obviously please feel free to put that in the comments. But in terms of how many pictures there are of the ships under construction, it used to be thought there weren't any, but recently a re-examination of some pre-existing pictures, as well as the digitization and publication of some that were held in archives in physical format only, has revealed that there are some, but not that many photos, particularly of Rodney. So this is a view of the shipyard that Rodney was being built in, and you can see Rodney on the left-hand side of the picture here, partially built. I have seen 1 or 2 photos that potentially might be Anson and or Howe, but they seem to be somewhat less, because unlike Hood, at least as far as the extant photos are, there doesn't seem to have been any particularly major concerted effort to chronicle her construction, or the construction of the other three specifically. This, for example, this picture is more generally just held to be a view of the shipyard in question. And it was only when people went, hang on a minute, the lines of this partially built ship over here on the left look rather familiar. Then they cross-checked the timeline, and there's like, that's actually an Admiral Class battlecruiser. So, yeah, there are more than we thought, but probably not more than a few dozen total, I would suspect. Phil Kreider asks, a recent trip to Nantucket got me wondering, what changes allowed US whaling fleets to routinely sail to the mid-South Pacific, whilst only a couple of centuries earlier, sailing ships had struggled to cross the Atlantic? It's a combination of factors. Firstly, a couple of centuries earlier, the average sailing ship was considerably smaller. You're talking about ships that are displacing dozens to low hundreds of tons as compared to ships, at least larger vessels, by the time that whaling really kicks off in the Pacific from the American whaling fleet's perspective at the end of the 1700s and beginning of the 1800s. By that point, your average whaler is going to be displacing several hundred tons and possibly considerably more than that, depending on the size of the ship. So obviously with a larger ship, it's more seaworthy, it's got more supplies, it can go further, and the routes to and from the Pacific and in and around the Pacific are much, much better known. Another factor is what's going on in South America, because towards the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th centuries, firstly, you have a decline in the amount of control that the Spanish have over South America. And then at the beginning of the 19th century, you start to see various wars of independence where the various former Spanish colonies get independence from Spain and become, roughly speaking, the countries we know today, like Peru, Chile, etc., etc. And what this means is that also thanks to some of the reforms in the latter part of the 18th century by various Spanish kings, the system where previously Spanish colonies had been extremely closed off to outside trade, they tried to make kind of it just an internal-only trade system, had gradually been being relaxed since the 16th century, through the 17th and now into the 18th. And that meant that whaling ships could call in at Spanish ports for rest and resupply. So you could sail from the east coast of the US down through the Atlantic, around the Cape of Storms, Cape Horn, and then you could call in at a Chilean or Peruvian port, resupply, restock, and then head out into the Pacific to do your whaling. And of course, once the countries became independent, then that entire restricted system collapsed completely. So it's a mixture of technological and political change. Greb asks, could you discuss the loss of the Regia Marina battleship Leonardo da Vinci in 1916? The Leonardo da Vinci was in the process of resupplying its stocks, including ammunition, one day in 1917, when there was a fire on board, immediately followed by an explosion, which resulted in her rolling over and sinking. Now, for a long time, this was attributed to Austro-Hungarian saboteurs, as was the loss of the pre-dreadnought a couple of years earlier, Benedetto Brin, which had also spontaneously exploded in harbour. Now, whilst that is still reported as the cause of loss in quite a number of different books and sources, more recently analysis has tended towards potentially it being an accident. Although the explosions of the two ships are slightly different. Benedetto Brin went up in a truly massive explosion, which was basically the entirety of the magazine in question cooking off almost at once. Whereas, as indicated by what I just mentioned, Leonardo da Vinci suffered an explosion, but it was an explosion that blew a hole in the side of the ship, which then caused the ship to capsize in a state that she was still pretty much able to be salvaged. The Italians did in fact refloat her and had the intention of restoring her and bringing her back into service, except they had no money in the post-World War I environment. which would tend to indicate a much smaller explosion, because if one of the main magazines on this ship had gone up, you'd be picking pieces of the ship off the entire harbour bottom. As it was, the explosions in the aft magazines punched some holes underwater, which then almost immediately flooded, which then obviously caused the ship to roll over and sink. Now, in terms of why, I mean, it's possible that Austro-Hungarian sabotage was culpable. I mean, both Austro-Hungary and Italy were constantly in efforts to use what we would today call special forces to sink the other side's battleships. But when you look at the Italian propellant at the time, it is somewhere in between British Cordite MD and the German propellant which they produced prior to World War I, but not the one they actually produced during World War I. So, given the problems that British Cordite MD had of shedding nitroglycerin and iron pyrite microcrystals, which probably contributed in several significant ways to the destruction of several battle cruisers and also ships like HMS Vanguard in harbour, it's not a huge stretch of the imagination to think that perhaps during the reloading process, somebody somewhere stuffed up slightly, whether that be through, disturbing a concentration of nitroglycerin dust that then went pop and was enough to set off a chain of explosives, or whether somebody was just smoking, or some other random happenstance, or just something had degraded to the point it just spontaneously went pop, which did happen in a couple of French ships, and, well, quite possibly on HMS Vanguard as well, that being the World War I Vanguard. So exactly what the cause is, okay, it's still theoretically up for debate, but I think there is a case to be made for Austro-Hungarian sabotage. There are quite a number of different methods by which it's conceivable that the propellant charges may have just decided to spontaneously disassemble themselves. And that brings us to the end of part 1 of Drydock 261. So thanks very much for listening, and I hope to see you in part 2, coming up soon. Or, if you've got this on the playlist, coming up now.